Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere a little different. Not to the castles or cobblestones of Europe this time, but into the thick, wet jungles of Southeast Asia during the 1960s and 70s. A time of war, exhaustion, and survival where thousands of young American soldiers found themselves trying to rest in a place that seemed designed to never let them. Forget the Hollywood war movies with clean uniforms and dramatic speeches. The truth is far less glamorous. Sleep in the Vietnam War wasn't peaceful, it wasn't restorative, and it often wasn't even possible. It was stolen in scraps between fear, noise, and the elements. And tonight, that's what we're sinking into. So before we begin, make sure you're settled. Dim your lights, maybe let a quiet hum of a fan or some background noise play to put you in the right mood. Take a moment to breathe, to let the day soften at the edges. Because we're about to slip into the jungle, where every sound mattered, where comfort was a memory, and where even closing your eyes for a few minutes felt like a gamble. Congratulations, you've just arrived in Vietnam during the height of the war. The good news, you're still breathing. The bad news, so is everything else around you. The insects, the humidity, the enemy soldiers just beyond the trees. Your bed tonight isn't a mattress. It's whatever patch of ground, mud, or hammock you can claim. And this is only the beginning. You open your eyes, and before you even sit up, you know where you are. The jungle doesn't let you forget. The air is thick before dawn, warm in a way that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel like it's already been breathed by something else. There is no silence here. The jungle has its own orchestra that never stops playing, not at night, not in the morning, not when you're trying desperately to get one more moment of rest. Crickets chirp in endless rhythm, cicadas buzz like power lines, frogs croak from unseen puddles, and birds you've never even heard of scream from the canopy, as if the sun itself needs announcing. You're not eased awake by an alarm clock on a nightstand. You're shaken awake by an entire ecosystem that doesn't care about schedules, let alone the fact that you were only asleep for a couple of hours. The first thing you notice when you blink the haze from your eyes is the sweat. It's already on your face, dripping from your hairline into your eyes. Your uniform shirt clings to you like it's been glued on. You slept in it, because you always sleep in it. And now it's plastered to your back in damp, salty patches. The jungle at night doesn't cool off like it does at home. There's no refreshing breeze slipping through an open window. The temperature barely changes. It's hot when you close your eyes, and it's hot when you open them. But there's a shift, a subtle one, when night becomes morning. Comes the humidity that already felt unbearable somehow thickens, and the insects that swarmed you through the dark seem even more awake than you are. Then come the sounds that don't belong to the forest. A distant rumble of artillery, so far away it's only a low vibration under your ribs. A burst of gunfire that cracks like dry branches breaking somewhere beyond the tree line. Helicopter blades chopping the air miles off, carrying someone else's story, someone else's fear. It's not happening to you in this moment, but it reminds you it could. That reminder is constant here. Every morning begins with the same knowledge. You're still alive, but you don't know for how long. The ground beneath you offers no comfort. If you were lucky, you managed to sling up a hammock between two trees, trying to angle it so you weren't completely exposed, trying to tuck the netting around you tightly enough to keep the mosquitoes out. But more often than not, the hammock sagged with the weight of the damp air, and water pooled beneath it when the rains came in the night. If you didn't have the space or the time, maybe you slept right on the dirt, the mud soaking into your fatigues until you couldn't tell where your body ended and the ground began. Rocks pressed into your hip bones, roots dug into your shoulders, and when you rolled over, you just traded one ache for another. Sometimes you were in a foxhole, carved out quick and shallow, just deep enough to get your body below the line of sight. You'd curl yourself up tight, rain dripping off your helmet, mud creeping under your collar, your rifle propped against your chest like a second rib cage. You slept that way because you had to, not because you wanted to. The jungle didn't care whether you rested or not, but the enemy might. Closing your eyes was the most vulnerable thing you did every single day. And then there's the smell. You can't escape it. The air is loaded with damp vegetation, rotting leaves, and the constant stench of mildew that grows on everything here, even on canvas, even on your skin. Sweat and smoke mix into it, and the faint chemical tang of insect repellent clings to your hands. You start to smell the jungle as much as you hear it. Every breath is a mixture of decay and life, and after a while, you can't tell which is which anymore. You shift in your spot, already itching. The mosquitoes never really let you go. They whined in your ears all night, slipping through any gap in your net, landing on your face, your hands, the thin fabric over your ankles. If it wasn't mosquitoes, it was ants, climbing up your gear, crawling across your skin, with a determination that made you wonder if they thought you were just another tree. Leeches were worse. Sometimes you didn't even feel them attach, only woke up to find your socks sticky with blood where they'd been feeding while you dreamed. Waking up in the jungle wasn't just about opening your eyes. It was about taking stock of how much had bitten you, crawled on you, or tried to drink from you during the hours you were unconscious. You scratch at your arms without thinking, the nails dragging over scabs that never have time to heal. The sweat makes the itch worse, the fabric rubs it raw, and you realise once again that your skin is just another battleground. The bugs always win. If you're lucky, the first thing you hear isn't your sergeant's voice barking an order, but most mornings it is. The jungle might be loud, but a human voice cuts through it sharper than anything else. It jolts you into sitting up, into pulling your rifle close, into wiping the grip from your eyes with a sleeve that's already stained and stiff. There's no snooze button here. When someone says, move, you move, no matter how heavy your body feels, no matter how much your eyelids fight to stay shut. You haven't had enough rest. You never do. But that doesn't matter. The jungle doesn't measure time by hours of sleep. It measures it by survival. The mosquitoes buzz, the birds scream, the helicopters thump somewhere far away. You sit in the mud or on your sagging hammock, feeling your spine complain and your legs stiff from being curled too long. Your mouth is dry, your tongue heavy with the taste of rations and cigarette smoke from the night before. There's no glass of water by the bed, no coffee pot gurgling awake, just a canteen that tastes faintly of metal, the water inside tepid and tinged with iodine tablets. You take a sip anyway, because there's no choice. Your boots, if you took them off at all, are damp inside, the fabric never fully drying no matter how long you leave them out. Sometimes you didn't take them off at all, because removing them meant risking trench foot, or stepping barefoot into something worse. So you shove your swollen feet back inside, feeling the squelch of sweat and mud, lacing them tight because you'll be walking again soon. You always are. The sun finally starts to push its way through the canopy, thin streaks of light cutting into the shadows. It doesn't feel like a new day. It feels like the continuation of the same endless one. The light doesn't bring relief. It just makes the heat worse, baking the damp air into a sticky weight that presses down on your shoulders. And yet, this is the closest thing to routine you have. Waking up in the jungle is never restful, never clean, never easy. It's just what you do over and over until you stop counting the mornings. And as you pull yourself up, shake the stiffness from your arms, and gather your gear, you know the real work hasn't even started yet. Sleeping out here was only the prelude. The day ahead will demand every bit of strength you didn't manage to recover during the night. And that, more than the insects, more than the heat, more than the mud clinging to your boots, is what makes opening your eyes in this place the hardest part of all. When it comes to rest in the jungle, you don't really sleep in a bed. You sleep in whatever compromise between exhaustion and the environment you can carve out for yourself. Soldiers arriving in Vietnam quickly realised that comfort was a forgotten luxury. The military issued hammocks, ponchos, and mosquito nets, but even with those, the conditions were anything but restful. A hammock sounds like a tropical escape, something strung between palm trees on a postcard, but the reality was different. The jungle hammock was made of tough canvas or nylon, heavy with dampness, strung low to avoid being seen, and often pitched at the wrong angle because there was no perfect place to tie it. One tree leaned too far, another was covered in ants, and if you were careless, you might wake up to find the whole thing sliding to the ground in the middle of the night. The hammock wasn't just for comfort, it was for survival. Sleeping on the ground meant waking up soaked, crawling with insects, or face to face with something that slithered. In monsoon season, the ground became a swamp, sucking at boots and pooling under bodies until men were half submerged while trying to sleep. A hammock, lifted even a foot above the ground, meant one less battle against mud. But staying off the ground created its own problems. The fabric sagged, your spine bowed into a shape that left you aching. And when rain blew sideways through the trees, it soaked you anyway. Mosquito netting was meant to keep out the swarms, but it never sealed completely. A corner untucked, a rip in the mesh, and you spent the night swatting instead of sleeping. And there was no escaping the weight of the air. Inside the net, the heat thickened. Sweat rolled down your chest, pooled in the hammock beneath you, and left you sticking to the canvas like glue. The chemical bite of insect repellent stung your eyes as you tried to keep bugs off your skin. If you wrapped yourself too tightly, you trapped the heat. If you left gaps, the mosquitoes poured in, whining at your ears, jabbing into your ankles, biting your knuckles until you had no choice but to scratch. Men joked that the jungle didn't want you dead, it wanted you miserable, and the hammock was proof of that. Ponchos were another kind of bed. Not the soft, clean ones folded neatly in camping stores today, but sheets of rubberized material that smelled faintly of chemicals and mildew. You could string them above the hammock as a makeshift roof, but the rain usually found its way in. Water collected in the folds and poured onto your face in the middle of the night, cold enough to make you gasp. Sometimes you spread the poncho directly on the ground, curling on top of it with your rifle as a pillow, praying the water didn't creep under the edges. Soldiers who tried this often woke up with the poncho floating around them like a raft. The ground refused to stay dry. It swallowed everything. The mud was relentless. It coated boots, uniforms, and gear, turning every object into something heavier and harder to carry. When you tried to rest, the mud seeped through clothing, climbing into seams, sticking to hair, grinding against skin until it left rashes and sores. It had its own smell, thick and sour, mixing with sweat and rot until your nose never knew what was worse. No matter how carefully you laid out a spot, you always woke up dirtier than before. Soldiers learned to sleep in filth because there was no choice. Clean was a word that belonged to another world. And then there were the nights when hammocks and ponchos weren't an option. Sometimes you slept in foxholes carved quickly with shovels, the earth piled high around the edges to give some cover. These were wet pits more than shelters, half filled with water after even a short rain. You curled into the muck, helmet tilted over your face, rifle clutched to your chest, and tried to ignore the worms wriggling at your boots. Sometimes you dug just deep enough for your hips, lying flat with your back pressed to the mud so your outline was harder to spot from a distance. It was called sleeping, but it was really waiting in the dark, half awake, half sinking into the soil. The mosquito net was supposed to be your last line of defence, but it was never enough. Even when tied tight, insects found their way inside. They landed on your skin with a persistence that drove men nearly insane. Their whining buzz never stopped, sometimes close enough to your ear to make you slap at your head in the dark. Leeches crawled up hammock lines, fattening themselves on soldiers' blood. Ants marched across boots, through the mesh, biting in lines that left welts. Some nights, you woke up covered in bites that burned worse than the heat. The net was less a barrier and more a suggestion. Rats were another kind of bedfellow. Drawn by the scraps of rations or the scent of sweat, they skidded through camp, climbing over packs, rustling through helmets, sometimes gnawing at boots while the men inside them tried not to move. You could feel their tiny claws scampering across the fabric of the hammock. Some were bold enough to chew through the mosquito netting itself, leaving holes for the bugs to follow. Snakes slithered through the undergrowth, sometimes winding themselves around branches not far from where hammocks hung. The jungle didn't have walls, and the bed you thought you had was never yours alone. Even the sound of the bed wasn't restful. The hammock creaked with every shift of your body. The poncho rustled like a flag in the damp wind. The mud sucked at you when you rolled. All of it mixed with the jungle's constant noise, making true stillness impossible. Sleep came in shallow bursts, never deep, never uninterrupted. Men learned to close their eyes in cycles, dozing off for minutes at a time, waking at every branch snap, every rustle of leaves, every splash of rain. You never sank into the kind of sleep that left you restored. You floated on the edge of it, ready to wake with your hand already gripping the rifle on your chest. And yet, despite all of this, exhaustion always won. The body could only stay alert for so long. After days of marching, sweating, and carrying heavy packs, soldiers collapsed into whatever passed for a bed. They dozed through the insects, through the mud, through the suffocating heat, until some sound jolted them awake again. That cycle repeated night after night, each bed another reminder that the jungle wasn't a place for rest, just a place to endure. The swampy bed wasn't really a bed at all. It was a compromise with an environment that gave nothing freely. Every inch of comfort was stolen from mud, water, insects and fear. Hammocks sagged, ponchos leaked, nets tore, and the ground swallowed everything. But men still tried, night after night, because without at least a scrap of sleep, the jungle would break you faster than the enemy ever could. The jungle doesn't just surround you, it presses into you. The moment the sun begins to push its way over the horizon, the heat arrives, and it never really leaves. It isn't the kind of dry warmth you might know from summer back home. This is a different thing altogether. The air itself feels wet, thick enough to swallow, heavy enough to weigh down every movement. Breathing becomes work, like pulling steam into your lungs. Your skin is damp within minutes of waking, and it stays that way until you lie down again at night, only to realise it hasn't dried at all. There's no escape, no cool corner, no breeze through an open window. The jungle heat doesn't ebb. It just sits on you, clinging as if it wants to see how long you can tolerate it. Your uniform becomes part of the punishment. The olive drab fatigues are already heavy when dry, and in the jungle they never are. Sweat soaks the shirt before you've even started moving, spreading from your chest to your back, from your waistband down your thighs. The fabric sticks to your body like another layer of skin, chafing where it rubs against itself, leaving raw patches that sting every time you shift your gear. The collar is stained dark, the cuffs stiff with salt, the whole thing smelling of mildew and old sweat that never had a chance to wash away. Even when you strip the shirt off to wring it out, it dries back into the same clammy shape within minutes of putting it on again. Your boots suffer the same fate. The jungle floor is rarely dry, and the humidity makes certain of it. Even when you haven't crossed a stream or slogged through knee-deep mud, the sweat from your own feet pools inside the leather. Each step squelches softly, a reminder that the water is always there, waiting. Trench foot becomes a constant threat, skin softening and peeling, toenails loosening, blisters forming under damp socks. Men tried to change socks whenever they could, stuffing wet ones into their packs to dry in the sun, but the sun only cooked them, leaving them stiff, still damp, and smelling like rot. No one's feet stayed healthy here. The humidity made sure of that. The body reacts to all of this in its own way. Sweat pours constantly, running into your eyes until they sting, dripping from your nose, sliding down your arms until your rifle stock is slick under your hands. You wipe your face with a sleeve, but it does nothing. Within seconds, the sweat is back, running along the same paths. Salt crusts along your eyebrows, stings in the corners of your mouth, dries into white streaks on the fabric of your pack. You can feel your shirt clinging tighter every time you move. It's like carrying your own swamp with you, trapped inside the folds of your uniform. And it isn't just the heat during the day. The nights don't bring relief. The temperature might dip slightly, but the humidity rises even higher. The air feels like it's trying to drown you without water. Sweat doesn't evaporate here. It just sits on your skin, sticky and heavy, inviting more insects to land. In the dark, when you roll in your hammock or on the mud, you feel the damp fabric cling tighter, and the smell of your own body mixes with the rot of the jungle around you. The sheets of sweat soak through everything you own, leaving nothing untouched. Every movement makes the heat worse. Carrying a 70-pound pack through the trees, climbing over roots, wading through tall grass, all of it turns your body into a furnace. Your helmet traps more heat, sweat dripping down into your ears until the padding squishes when you adjust it. Even standing still doesn't stop it. The jungle is never cool, never dry, and never still. The soldiers tried every trick they knew. Some unbuttoned their shirts, rolled up sleeves, hoping for airflow that never came. Others went shirtless when they could, only to burn under the sun or find their bare skin attacked by mosquitoes. Helmets came off when officers weren't watching, replaced by soft caps or nothing at all, but the air offered no mercy. Some rubbed insect repellent over their arms and faces, hoping the sharp chemical bite would distract from the heat, but it only stung against the salt in their sweat. There was no solution, just coping, each man finding his own way to endure the endless wet heat that seemed to seep directly into his bones. The jungle itself amplified it. The canopy above blocked direct sun, but trapped the heat below like a greenhouse. Every plant seemed to sweat too, releasing more moisture into the air until breathing felt like sipping broth. When it rained, the water hit the leaves and steamed back up almost immediately, turning the world into a boiling pot you couldn't climb out of. The smell of wet foliage mixed with the sour odour of your own sweat until the two were inseparable. You became part of the jungle's rot, your own body just another thing slowly breaking down in the damp. Sleep didn't change it. At night, sweat soaked through the hammock fabric, dripping into your gear below, leaving stains that never dried. Your mosquito net trapped more of the heat, turning it into a small personal greenhouse that smelled of your own body. Lifting the net meant more insects, so you stayed inside, sweating harder, scratching at bites, shifting constantly, never finding relief. Some men slept with their shirts open, others stripped down to just their shorts, but nothing worked. You woke up just as wet as when you lay down, and sometimes wetter. The heat gnawed at more than the body. It frayed patience, wore down nerves, and made temper short. Men cursed the sweat, cursed the uniforms, cursed the jungle itself. Jokes about being boiled alive turned sour when no one laughed anymore. Exhaustion mixed with irritation until even small tasks, loading a magazine, cleaning a rifle, tying a hammock line, felt like unbearable work under the constant drizzle of sweat. The jungle wasn't just a battlefield. It was a slow torture chamber, and the heat was one of its most reliable tools. Water was supposed to help, but even drinking it offered no relief. The canteen water was always warm, flavoured with iodine or chlorine, tasting faintly of metal. It didn't quench the thirst so much as fill the mouth with another taste to battle the salt of sweat. Men drank constantly, their bodies desperate to replace what the jungle took away. Dehydration still crept in, masked by the feeling of being soaked all the time. Faintness came on suddenly, black spots in vision, legs buckling under the pack. Heat exhaustion was as real a threat as bullets, and the jungle didn't care which one got you first. In this environment, even rest was just another way to sweat. Lying down didn't cool you. It just made new patches of your skin stick to damp fabric. Hammocks sagged under wet bodies, leaving imprints of salt and moisture long after you got up. Mud clung to the backs of legs, drying into cracks that reopened as soon as more sweat softened them again. The body never dried out here. You were either soaked from rain, from swamp water, or from yourself. Day after day, night after night, the cycle repeated. Sweat poured, uniforms stuck, boots squelched, helmets dripped, tempers frayed. It became the backdrop to every memory, the first thing you noticed when you woke, and the last thing you felt before you closed your eyes. Heat and humidity weren't obstacles to overcome. They were conditions you endured, constant companions as unavoidable as the ground you walked on. And in the middle of it all, you kept moving, kept working, kept trying to rest when you could. The jungle gave you no choice. It wrapped itself around you, sank into you, and made sure that every second of your time there was marked by the steady trickle of sweat. You never really got silence in Vietnam. The jungle was alive in ways that no American town or city could prepare you for. Even in the dead of night, when you thought the world should be still, the forest hummed with its own endless chorus. Crickets kept a rhythm so steady it became background noise, a constant chirp that rose and fell like breathing. Cicadas whined high above, their droning sound vibrating through the leaves like electrical wires. Frogs croaked from puddles and ditches, their voices deep and guttural, layered on top of the crickets in a strange harmony. Somewhere far off, a bird screamed with a call so sharp and alien it made you wonder what kind of creature could even make that noise. All of it layered together, so thick that it became impossible to pick out silence at all. The jungle itself was never quiet. At first, soldiers tried to make sense of it. Every rustle in the brush set nerves on edge. Every shift of leaves sounded like footsteps. But after enough nights, the mind began to separate what belonged to the jungle and what didn't. The trick was learning fast. If you treated every sound like danger, you'd never rest at all. If you ignored the wrong one, you might not wake up. The crickets, the cicadas, the frogs, those were just nature's heartbeat. But a snapping branch at the wrong time, the heavy drag of something larger through the brush, the metallic click of a rifle being handled in the dark. Those sounds cut through everything else, and they never stopped putting ice down your spine. During the day, the jungle orchestra only grew louder. Birds screeched from every direction, monkeys howled like they were mocking you, and insects filled every gap with their relentless buzzing. Helicopters thumped overhead, the sound of rotors chopping the air into pieces. Sometimes they came close, sending hot gusts of wind down through the canopy, rattling branches, shaking loose leaves. Other times they were far away, just a low hum on the horizon, a reminder that somewhere else another unit was being lifted or another fight was beginning. The sound of a helicopter was both comfort and dread. It meant supplies, reinforcements, or evacuation, but it also meant someone was in trouble. And then there was gunfire. Short bursts, sharp cracks, long rolling stutters that cut through the forest like tearing fabric. Sometimes it was close enough to rattle your chest, other times distant, muffled, like thunder caught between the trees. You never got used to it. Even when it wasn't aimed at you, it pulled at the nerves, made your stomach tighten. Gunfire at night was worse. The flashes lit up the jungle in brief, terrifying strobe, and the echo bounced around the trees until you couldn't tell direction. One shot could sound like 5 different ones, all coming from different places. The jungle turned sound into a weapon, twisting it until no one could be sure what was near and what was far. Explosions joined the chorus too. Mortars, artillery, grenades. They didn't just make sound, they made the air itself shake. The ground rippled under your body when shells hit nearby, dirt showering down through the leaves. Even far-off artillery left a low, rolling thunder that followed you through the day. sometimes lasting hours at a stretch. It reminded you that the war was always moving, even if you were stuck in one patch of jungle. Somewhere, someone else was under fire, and the sound carried miles to find you. The smaller noises mattered just as much. The metallic clink of a canteen swinging on a belt, the scrape of boots against rocks, the quiet click of a rifle safety being switched off. In the middle of the jungle's endless chatter, those sounds stood out like alarms. Soldiers learned to move carefully, to keep their gear tight, to silence every possible noise. Because the enemy was listening too. They knew the jungle's language, and they could hear when something didn't belong. At night, lying in your hammock, you'd close your eyes and hear it all layered together. The hum of insects pressed right up against your ears, the occasional splash of something moving in the water, the distant chop of rotor blades, the snap of a twig that made every muscle tighten as you gripped your rifle closer. You never fully slept. Part of you always stayed awake, ears straining against the dark, waiting for a sound that meant the difference between a restless night and a deadly one. Even when nothing happened, the anticipation itself wore you down. The jungle filled your head with so much noise that you never got quiet inside yourself. Thoughts raced. Eyes darted at every movement. Ears caught on every branch creak. The body needed rest, but the mind refused, tuned permanently to listen for danger. And the longer it went on, the more the regular jungle noises seemed to fade into one dull blur, until the only things that stood out were the ones you feared most. Sometimes, though, the sounds that haunted you weren't even from the jungle or the war. They came from the men themselves. Snores rumbling from a foxhole. A cough in the dark, sharp and uncontrolled. Whispers passing between soldiers who couldn't sleep. The click of a lighter as someone tried to sneak a cigarette. Every one of those noises carried, and everyone risked giving away your position. Silence wasn't just about comfort, it was survival. Soldiers scolded each other for even small sounds. A laugh too loud, the crackle of a candy wrapper. Out here, anything could betray you. And then there was the strangest sound of all, the sudden absence of it. When the jungle went quiet, when the crickets stopped and the birds fell silent, men froze. The silence never lasted long, but it was sharp and heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Often, it meant nothing more than a predator moving through, or a shift in the weather. But sometimes it meant people, and those moments stretched long in the mind. When even the animals went quiet, you felt the weight of danger pressing in, and your finger tightened on the trigger without thinking. Morning didn't end the noise. Helicopters buzzed more often, their rotors thumping against the rising heat. Convoys clattered along distant roads. The jungle's own sounds only grew harsher under the sun. Insects buzzing so loud it felt like they drilled into your ears. By then you'd stopped noticing most of it. The brain gave up, tuned it all into one endless static. But still, the sharp noises cut through. The burst of a rifle, the sudden boom of a grenade, the distant voice carried by the wind. Those sounds always sliced through the static, leaving you alert all over again. The jungle was never silent, never restful, never forgiving. Every sound told a story, some of them harmless, some of them lethal, and you never had the privilege of tuning them out completely. Your life depended on listening, on knowing when the chorus of insects was just insects, and when the wrong sound meant everything was about to change. When the sun went down in the jungle, the real roommates came out. You weren't alone in your hammock, or in your foxhole, or on the patch of mud you tried to convince yourself could pass as a bed. The jungle had its own residents, and they weren't shy about reminding you that you were just a temporary guest. If the daylight hours wore you down with heat and sweat, the nighttime hours tested how much discomfort a human body could take without breaking. The mosquitoes were always the first to make themselves known. They came in clouds so thick it felt like the air itself was buzzing. Even with repellent smeared on your arms, legs and neck, they found ways through. The DEET stung your skin, mixed with sweat until it burned your eyes, but the insects weren't deterred for long. The high-pitched whine was constant, sometimes right in your ear, close enough to make you swat blindly in the dark. You pulled a mosquito net tight, tucking it under your hammock, sealing every corner, but there was always one gap you missed. One seam loose enough for a dozen to slip through. You woke with bites across your hands, across your face, across the line of your jaw where the net brushed against your skin. The itching started before you even opened your eyes fully. A reminder that no matter how carefully you prepared, the jungle always got its share. Some men tried to ignore them, pressing their faces into their arms, wrapping their sleeves over their ears to block the noise. Others gave up and scratched until their skin was raw, trading one misery for another. The worst were the bites that swelled in the heat, turning red and hard, spreading until it felt like your whole arm was throbbing. You knew what they carried. Malaria, dengue, things that didn't need a bullet to take you down. You swallowed anti-malaria pills, bitter chalky tablets that left your mouth dry, but they didn't protect you from the endless buzzing or the welts that came in waves every night. If the mosquitoes were relentless, the leeches were patient. They didn't hum, they didn't sting, they didn't even warn you they were there. They just attached quietly and drank. You only discovered them later, when you felt the squish in your sock, or saw the slow, dark line of blood soaking through your fatigues. Pulling them off wasn't simple. If you yanked too hard, their teeth stayed behind, leaving wounds that festered in the damp. The proper way was to burn them with a match or sprinkle salt, but in the middle of the night, half asleep, no one had the patience. Fingers clawed them off, leaving streaks of blood across your skin. In the morning your socks were wet, not just with sweat, but with what they had taken during the night. Some leeches dropped from branches, finding their way down collars or onto bare arms. Others crawled up hammock ropes, inching their way through to reach the warm body inside. Men joked bitterly that the leeches never went hungry, that they were the only ones thriving in this place. But the humour wore thin when infection set in, when bites turned into sores that wouldn't heal, when you realised that even resting still meant losing something to the jungle. Then there were the ants. They came in armies, pouring across the ground in lines so thick they looked like moving cables. If you tied your hammock too close to their path, they climbed right up, swarming across the fabric, biting as they went. Some species were small, leaving stings that itched for hours. Others were larger, their bites sharp enough to make you yelp in the dark. And once they found food, crumbs of rations, a half-finished cigarette, even the salt of your sweat, they didn't leave. Whole colonies moved through camps at night, overrunning boots, helmets, and anything left on the ground. Waking up to feel them crawling along your arms wasn't rare. The trick was staying still long enough to brush them off without alerting anyone else, without making noise that might carry beyond your own small circle of misery. rats made their own presence known. Drawn by scraps of food or the smell of sweat, they skittered through camp at night, claws clicking softly on metal canteens, tails brushing against bare ankles. Some grew bold enough to climb hammocks, gnawing at the corners of mosquito nets to reach whatever crumbs might be left in a pocket. They chewed through boots, packs, and sometimes flesh if a soldier didn't stir quickly enough. You could feel them scurrying across your chest, and for a second in the dark, you didn't know if it was a rat or something worse. Swatting sent them running, but they always came back, darting just out of sight, waiting for stillness again. Snakes slithered through the undergrowth, silent and almost invisible. Most stayed away, but every soldier had a story of waking to find one too close. Some were harmless, others deadly, and in the dark you couldn't always tell the difference. They slid into boots left out overnight, coiled under ponchos, or dropped from branches above. The jungle never missed a chance to remind you that you were outnumbered. Spiders built webs across narrow trails, their strands sticking to your face as you walked half asleep through the night. Scorpions hid in gear, stinging hands that reached blindly for rations or cigarettes. Even centipedes, long and armoured, crawled into bedding, their bite leaving fire that lingered long after. There was no such thing as sleeping alone here. Every night was a negotiation between your body and everything else that wanted a piece of it. Some men tried tricks, coating hammock ropes in grease to stop ants and leeches, tucking pants into boots to keep out crawlers, shaking out every piece of clothing before putting it on. Others just accepted it, swatting, scratching, and bleeding their way through the night. You didn't talk about comfort anymore. Comfort was a concept that belonged to another life. The goal here was simply to get enough rest to function the next day, even if it meant sharing your space with things that bit, stung, or crawled. The noises they made blended into the larger soundscape. The soft hum of mosquitoes near your ear, the faint rustle of a rat moving through gear, the almost imperceptible slide of a leech along the hammock cord. Each sound was small, but together they created a background that kept you just shy of real sleep. You drifted in and out, body surrendering to exhaustion, while your mind stayed half awake, aware of every scratch, every itch, every faint brush against your skin. It wasn't just discomfort. It was a slow grinding down of the body. Bites turned into sores, scratching open skin that never had a chance to heal. Constant loss of blood to leeches left some men weak, pale, shaky. The risk of disease was always there, carried by mosquitoes, spread through wounds that festered in the damp. Even if you didn't catch anything serious, the constant irritation wore you thin, left you raw and short-tempered, quick to anger over nothing at all. The jungle wasn't just fighting you in daylight battles. It was fighting you in your sleep, every single night. And still, men lay down, tied their hammocks, pulled their nets tight, and tried again. Because there was no alternative. Rest had to come from somewhere, even if it came at the cost of welts, scratches, and bloodstains on your socks. You learned to live with the jungle's roommates, to scratch quietly, to flick rats away with one hand while keeping your rifle steady in the other. It wasn't peace, it wasn't sleep the way you remembered it, but it was the closest thing you had to it here. The human body isn't meant to rest with 70 pounds strapped to it, but in the jungle, the gear was never far away. You didn't fold it neatly at the side of your bed. You didn't stash it under a cot. You slept with it, on it, and sometimes under it. because the line between being asleep and being in danger was too thin to take chances. The rifle in particular wasn't just a tool. It was an extension of your body, something you didn't dare separate from yourself, even for the hours you tried to sleep. The M16 was light compared to older weapons, but not when you carried it day after day, or when you tried to curl around it in the mud. You learned the shape of it the way you once knew the outline of your pillow. The metal stock pressed against your ribs, the barrel dug into the crook of your arm, the sling wrapped tight across your shoulder so it wouldn't slide away while you drifted off. You clutched it the way a child clutches a blanket, not out of comfort, but out of fear. If you woke to gunfire, you didn't have the luxury of fumbling. It had to already be in your hands. That habit seeped into everything. You laid your body in ways that kept the rifle close, even if it meant a rock pressing into your spine or a root digging into your hip. Hammocks sagged under the combined weight of you and the weapon, the stock sometimes digging into your chest as you turned. In foxholes, the rifle lay across your lap, rain dripping from the barrel into your boots while you pretended the position was restful. On the ground, you slid your arm through the sling and curled around it, waking up stiff, your shoulder burning, but reassured that the weapon hadn't left your side. It wasn't just the rifle. The rest of the gear followed you into sleep. The web belt with canteens and ammo pouches never strayed far, sometimes worn even as you lay back, because there was no guarantee you'd have time to throw it on in the dark. The rucksack served as a pillow, lumpy and unforgiving, straps digging into your neck, the smell of wet socks and old rations filling your nose. Boots were rarely removed, because they took too long to lace, and the ground was too alive with things you didn't want to feel against bare feet. So you slept with them on, ankles stiff, arches aching, the weight of damp leather clinging to you even in your dreams. The helmet was its own problem. Some men kept it on, letting it tilt forward against their forehead as they tried to drift off. It was heavy, awkward, pressing into their brow until the skin went sore. But taking it off left you exposed, and setting it down meant risking it filling with water, or being knocked away in a rush. So it stayed, another reminder that the jungle allowed no true rest. You carried the war even into the moments when your eyes were closed. Shifting position was never easy. You rolled carefully, mindful not to knock a magazine loose or clatter a canteen against a rock. Even small noises could echo in the stillness, and discipline meant controlling every movement, even in half sleep. Men learned to turn with the weapon in hand, cradling it like a fragile thing, muzzle pointed away from themselves, but never out of reach. The weight was constant, digging into muscle and bone until the body accepted it as normal. It became part of you in ways that would be hard to let go of later, when silence finally came and the jungle was no longer pressing in. The gear wasn't clean or neat. Mud clung to straps, rust spotted metal. Fabric smelled of mildew and oil. The rucksack never dried. The canteens banged against your side even when you tried to still them. The helmet strap chafed your chin raw. But you couldn't strip it away at night. To sleep without it was to gamble, and gambling wasn't a habit you could afford. Every night meant hauling the same burden into your chosen corner of the jungle, arranging yourself among it like someone trying to rest in a pile of stones. Some soldiers made jokes about it, calling their rifles bedmates, treating them with the kind of grim humour that came from knowing there was no choice. Others grew attached in quieter ways, checking them obsessively, cleaning them even when there was no time for themselves. The rifle became the only constant in an environment that shifted endlessly. You could lose friends, lose ground, lose any sense of safety, but as long as you had the weapon in your hand when you woke, there was a thread of control. Thin, fragile, but something. And the weight never truly left. Even in sleep, muscles stayed tense, shoulders hunched around the stock, fingers brushing the trigger guard without thinking. The body didn't loosen the way it did at home. It stayed half ready, curled around gear like armour, eyes fluttering open at the smallest sound. You told yourself you were sleeping, but in truth you were just lying still, holding on to the tools that might give you one more morning. It was more than habit. It was survival. You carried the gear when you walked, you carried it when you stopped, and you carried it into sleep because it carried you through everything else. The weight pressed down on you, reshaped your body, left your shoulders aching and your back bent. But it was the one burden you couldn't put aside, not even for the hours when you needed rest most. And when dawn came and the jungle sounds rose again, you didn't reach for your gear because it was already there, pressed into your chest, wrapped around your body, soaked with your sweat. You rose with it, stiff and sore, and moved on, because letting go wasn't an option in this place. Digging into the earth became as common as eating or drinking. The jungle didn't give you walls, and it didn't give you safety, so you made both with a shovel. The entrenching tool was short, awkward, and dull, but you carried it everywhere, because when the order came to dig in, you needed it. Sometimes it meant scraping at mud with your hands. Other times it meant carving through roots as thick as wrists. All of it done under the pressing heat or in the dark with only the glow of a red-lensed flashlight. The foxhole was supposed to protect you, but the jungle had a way of turning it into another punishment. The ground never stayed still. One night it was firm enough to hold shape. The next, it turned into soup under the first rain. You'd dig a shallow pit, just deep enough for you and your buddy to curl inside, and by morning it was half filled with brown water. You bailed it out with helmets, your arms aching, the mud creeping up your legs until you couldn't tell where the hole ended and your body began. Sleeping in it meant curling into a damp trench, your boots submerged, your gear slick, your rifle balanced on your knees so it didn't get swallowed by the muck. Every roll of thunder overhead reminded you that more water was coming, and there was no tarp big enough to keep it out. The smell inside a foxhole was something that never left you. Wet earth mixed with sweat, insect repellent, and sometimes the faint coppery tang of blood from cuts and scrapes you didn't even realise you had until the water stung them. Mosquitoes found their way in no matter how deep you dug, and leeches loved the cool, damp corners, sliding along your boots as you tried to ignore them. Rats sometimes darted across your lap, quick shadows looking for scraps. You pressed your back against the wall of earth. Helmet tilted low, rifle clutched to your chest, and tried to let exhaustion take you. Sleep came, but never fully. Every snap of a branch above made your eyes open. Every gust of wind that rustled the canopy sent your heart into your throat. Trenches were larger, but not much better. When patrol bases or fire bases were carved into the jungle, men spent hours digging long lines of dirt, reinforced with sandbags, meant to give cover during incoming fire. They doubled as sleeping quarters. You stretched out along the wall, Boots against one sandbag, head against another, the ground beneath you damp and uneven. Ponchos were strung overhead when possible, sagging under collected rain until they poured streams of water onto whoever lay below. You slept with your helmet on, not because it was comfortable, but because the walls above you sometimes crumbled, sending clumps of dirt and rocks tumbling down. Trenches weren't meant for comfort, they were meant for survival, and in the moments when no fire came, you closed your eyes inside them anyway, because you had no choice. Improvised shelters took a dozen different forms, none of them ideal. Sometimes it was as simple as leaning branches against each other, covering them with a poncho to make a triangle of shade, crawling underneath with your knees pressed to your chest. Other times it meant stacking sandbags, not just to block bullets, but to create a space where you could curl up unseen. Men learned to weave palm fronds into crude mats, laying them down to keep themselves from sinking into the mud, though they never lasted long before rotting away. Bamboo poles lashed together made frames for poncho tents, but the jungle chewed through rope and fabric alike. Everything was temporary here. Everything sagged or tore or collapsed under rain. There was never enough space. Foxholes were meant for 2 men, but sometimes 3 squeezed inside, shoulders pressed together, gear piled between knees, rifles across laps. You felt every movement your buddy made, every shift of weight, every breath in the dark. Privacy didn't exist. If someone coughed, you felt it in your chest. If someone shook from fever or chills, you were pressed close enough to know. And yet that closeness was its own fragile comfort. Alone in the jungle, every noise felt like a threat. With someone beside you, even if they were just as exhausted and miserable, you felt a little less likely to vanish into the night. The discipline of it all shaped how you rested. When ordered to dig, you dug, even if you were too tired to stand. When told to stay low, you pressed yourself deeper, even when the mud filled your pockets and boots. You didn't stretch out your legs or roll onto your side for comfort, because the position you kept mattered more than your spine. Sleep wasn't the goal. Readiness was. You closed your eyes because your body gave you no choice, not because the foxhole felt like a place to rest. Some men developed rituals with their shelters. One always lined the bottom with sandbags if he could spare them. Another tucked dry socks under his helmet, away from the mud. Some carved small drainage channels around their foxholes, hoping the rainwater would run off instead of pooling inside. Little tricks, small adjustments, all of them done with the knowledge that nothing worked forever. The rain always found a way in. The insects always returned. The mud always won. There was also the constant reminder that foxholes and trenches weren't just places to sleep. They were also where you waited out incoming fire. Shells didn't pause because you were exhausted. Mortars fell in the middle of the night, explosions rocking the ground, dirt raining down into the pit you were supposed to be safe inside. Some men never made it out of their holes at all. You knew that every time you closed your eyes. You dug your shelter to protect you, but it could just as easily become the last place you rested. And yet, every night, after the patrols, after the watches, after the long hours of carrying gear through the jungle, you climbed into them anyway. You pulled your knees tight, shifted your rifle across your chest, leaned your helmet against the damp wall, and tried to trick your body into thinking this hole was a bed. You ignored the water creeping into your boots, the bugs crawling across your arms, the smell of earth in your nose. You let exhaustion drag you under for a few moments at a time, ready to snap awake when someone nudged your shoulder, or when the jungle fell silent in the wrong way. Foxholes, trenches, makeshift shelters. They were all the same in the end. Not places to sleep, but places to endure. You dug them, you cursed them, you lived inside them night after night, and when the sun rose, you climbed out, mud caked on your arms, uniforms soaked through, gear heavier than ever. And you carried on, because the jungle didn't offer alternatives. Rain in the jungle wasn't just weather. It was a season, a weight, a punishment that lasted for months without pause. The monsoons didn't come gently or in short bursts. They arrived with force, sheets of water hammering through the canopy, soaking everything in their path, and they stayed. For soldiers trying to sleep, the rain was less a backdrop and more a constant enemy that never gave you even a moment of dry ground. When the first drops fell, you already knew what was coming. The leaves shook under the impact, streams forming almost instantly along branches before dripping down in heavy plops that sounded like footsteps. Within minutes, the forest floor turned to mud, sucking at boots and swallowing gear. The ponchos went up quickly, stretched between trees, tied to bamboo poles, anything that could hold them. But ponchos weren't roofs. They sagged under the weight of water, pooling until the seams burst and sent a cold rush straight onto your face as you tried to sleep beneath them. You could hear it coming, the fabric creaking, the water shifting, and then the inevitable flood pouring onto your chest. No matter how many times you bailed them out, the rain always found its way in. Inside a hammock, the rain became another kind of trap. The mosquito net, pulled tight to keep out the insects, trapped the heat and moisture until you were lying in your own steam bath. The hammock sagged lower as the straps slipped on wet bark, the fabric beneath you dripping cold water down your back. Some nights the rain came in at an angle, blown sideways by wind, and no matter how well you wrapped yourself, it soaked you. Your uniform clung tighter, the fabric heavy with water, chafing against your skin until it felt like sandpaper. Boots filled up, socks squished with every movement, and even when you wrung them out, they never dried. On the ground, there was no hope of staying dry. Foxholes became ponds within an hour of heavy rain. Men sat waist-deep in water, rifles balanced across their laps, ponchos stretched above them like flimsy umbrellas, while the rain poured down the sides into the very holes they'd spent hours digging. The walls caved in, mud collapsing into gear, burying packs and soaking ammunition. Sleeping in those conditions meant curling against the wall, water lapping at your ribs, helmet tilted forward to keep rain from streaming into your eyes. You didn't lie down to sleep so much as float in place, drifting in and out of consciousness, while the rain drummed so loud it drowned out even the sound of your own thoughts. The noise was relentless. Raindrops pounded on ponchos, hammered against helmets, splashed into puddles with a rhythm so constant it became maddening. You couldn't hear the crickets or the cicadas anymore. You couldn't hear your own buddy whispering next to you. The rain drowned out everything, a wall of sound that made the jungle feel like it had been swallowed whole. For some, that noise was a kind of cover, masking small movements, making the enemy less likely to hear. For others, it was torture, keeping them awake, never letting them settle into the quiet they craved. The smell of the jungle changed with the rain. Rot thickened in the air as leaves broke down faster. The mud stank of stagnant water and mildew, and the soldiers themselves smelled worse. Uniforms never dried, socks turned sour, boots reeked of mould, and skin carried the constant tang of damp fabric. Trench foot spread quickly, skin whitening, cracking, peeling until every step was agony. Some men changed socks religiously, tucking the wet ones under their shirts in hopes body heat might dry them. But in the monsoon, it was useless. Everything stayed wet. You lay there at night, soaked to the bone, your body shivering despite the heat because the damp never left. The rain chilled you in ways sweat never did, pulling warmth from your skin until your teeth chattered under your helmet. You tried to curl tighter in the hammock, hugging your rifle closer, but the stock was slick with water, cold against your cheek. You tried to shift against the mud, finding some patch less submerged, but the water always rose again, seeping into places you couldn't ignore. It didn't matter if you closed your eyes. The rain pressed into every sense. You heard it, smelled it, tasted it as drops rolled into your mouth. Sleep, when it came, was shallow. You dozed with your face half covered, mouth pressed against damp sleeves, ears ringing with the pounding of water. Dreams blended with reality, flashes of lightning turning the world into white sheets for seconds at a time, thunder cracking overhead so loud it rattled your chest. Sometimes you woke in a panic, convinced the light was muzzle flash, the sound artillery. Sometimes you didn't wake at all, just drifted back into the same damp haze. The monsoon also meant danger never stopped at nightfall. Mudslide crept down hillsides, swallowing foxholes, shifting tree roots until trunks toppled. Rivers swelled overnight, cutting off trails you had marched only the day before. Leeches thrived, dropping from branches in the rain, crawling through water into boots and up legs. Mosquitoes swarmed worse in the wet, finding their way through nets that sagged under the weight of rain. You couldn't escape them, couldn't swat fast enough, couldn't scratch without tearing your already raw skin. The rain made them stronger and you weaker. Men adapted the only way they could. Some slept sitting up, backs pressed to mud walls, ponchos draped across their helmets like hoods. Others dug drainage ditches around their foxholes, only to watch them fill anyway. A few tied hammocks under makeshift poncho roofs, water dripping through in steady streams they learned to ignore. But no matter how clever the setup, the rain always won. In the morning, uniforms clung heavy, boots sloshed, gear weighed twice what it had before. Rifles rusted if you didn't strip them down and clean them daily. Ammunition swelled and warped. Even paper, maps, letters, photographs turned soft and useless, the ink bleeding into illegible smears. And still you had to rest. The body couldn't fight endlessly, couldn't march without pause. So you lay in the mud, in the water, under the leaking poncho, and took what little you could. 10 minutes here, half an hour there, broken stretches that never restored you. Waking was as miserable as sleeping. You rose stiff, soaked, your skin wrinkled and pale from hours of damp. You wrung out your socks, shook your helmet dry, and started again, knowing the rain wasn't finished. It wouldn't be finished for months. The monsoon season didn't just soak the jungle. It soaked you through and through, until you couldn't tell where the rain ended and your own sweat began. It blurred the line between day and night, between waking and sleeping. You didn't get to dream of dry sheets or warm blankets anymore. You dreamed of nothing but being less wet, less heavy, less drowned in the constant downpour that became your life. And when the rain eased for even a moment, you almost missed it. Not because you liked it, but because the silence felt so unnatural. You didn't trust it. The jungle was loud, it was wet, it was hot, but above all of that, it was thick with smell. Every breath carried reminders of where you were and what you were enduring. It wasn't one smell, not one note you could describe and set aside. It was a stew, a heavy mixture of sweat, rot, mildew, smoke, and gunpowder that seeped into everything you owned and everything you were. You didn't escape it by turning your head. You didn't breathe fresh air by moving to a different patch of ground. The air itself was saturated, and whether you were awake, asleep, or something in between, you were breathing it. Sweat came first. It came from you, from the men beside you, from everyone who had been carrying packs through the brush for hours. Fatigues soaked through, helmets damp inside, boots squishing with every step. The salt of it dried into white streaks on collars and sleeves, then rehydrated the moment more sweat poured out of you. It had its own sting, its own sour edge that clung to skin. In close quarters, inside foxholes or under ponchos, the smell thickened until it was inescapable. You breathed in your own exhaustion, and the exhaustion of the man lying next to you, each lungful heavy with salt and fatigue. Even when you tried to rest, your nose was full of it, the smell of your own body breaking itself down in the heat. Then came the jungle itself, always rotting, always feeding on what fell. Leaves broke down into mulch that stank of wet earth and decay. Dead animals, hidden under brush or floating in flooded paddies, released odours sharp enough to make you gag even when you were used to worse. Mud wasn't just mud. It carried the stench of rot, of standing water thick with larvae, of plants giving up their structure to the damp. At night, when you shifted in your hammock or leaned against a dirt wall, the smell of mould and mildew pressed into your nose. Nothing dried here. Gear grew spots of fungus. Boots carried the smell of swamp inside them, and ponchos reeked of damp rubber long after you tried to shake them out. The jungle never let you forget that everything was rotting, including you. Food added its own layer. Sea rations came in cans that smelled faintly of metal and grease. Open them in the heat, and the odour clung to your fingers, to your pack, to your breath after you choked them down. Ham and lima beans had their own reputation, not because of the taste alone, but because of the way the smell lingered in your shelter long after the can was empty. Coffee powder, mixed with tepid water, carried the bitterness of both caffeine and iodine, leaving your mouth dry with a metallic tang. Cigarettes were everywhere, their smoke cutting through the jungle stench, but adding their own stale haze to the air. Light one at night, and the sulphur from the match, the acrid burn of tobacco. It all hung in the damp air, mixing with sweat and mildew until it was another permanent note in the background. But the war itself made the strongest impressions. Gunpowder had a sharpness you couldn't mistake. After firing, the acrid smoke stuck to your uniform, clung to your skin, filled your nose until every breath tasted of burned chemicals. It didn't fade quickly. Even after the shooting stopped, you carried it with you, the smell marking you as someone who had just been through it. Explosions added another layer, the bitter tang of burned earth and hot metal rolling over the landscape. Napalm was worse. Its smell wasn't just smoke, it was chemical fire, sharp enough to make your throat close, unforgettable once you breathed it in. Men described it as gasoline mixed with burning plastic, a stench that carried for miles and settled into your clothes, your hair, your memory. There were darker smells too, the ones you didn't talk about unless you had to. The smell of death lingered in the jungle in ways that were impossible to ignore. Heat and humidity didn't allow anything to rest quietly. Bodies swelled, decomposed, released odours that carried far through the trees. Sometimes it was an animal, sometimes it wasn't, and you didn't always want to know which. That smell stuck in the throat, heavy and sour, turning food into something you couldn't swallow, turning water into something you couldn't drink. You couldn't wash it off, couldn't step away from it. Once it was in your nose, it stayed, even when you tried to sleep. Fires added smoke to the mix, smoke that wasn't like a campfire at home. Jungle wood burned damp, releasing a heavy, choking smell that coated your lungs. Mixed with gasoline, it became sharper, chemical, impossible to escape. After bombardments, the air carried both smoke and dust, particles that stuck to your sweat-soaked skin, leaving you coughing even as you tried to close your eyes. Some nights, smoke drifted into camp from far off burning, faint but constant, a reminder that something was still smouldering in the distance. All of it combined into a single environment, one where smell was never neutral. Even the briefest attempt at rest meant lying in a cloud of odours that reminded you of everything happening outside your hammock or foxhole. You smelled your body failing under the heat, the jungle consuming itself, the rations you forced down, the cigarettes you burned for a moment of distraction, the gunpowder from the last fight, the smoke from something burning, and the rot that never left. Sleep didn't give you relief from it. Dreams carried the smells forward, made them part of the background noise inside your head. Men tried to mask it in small ways. Some chewed gum to cut the taste of iodine water. Others smoked more cigarettes, filling their lungs with something they could control instead of the mix around them. A few carried small bottles of aftershave or deodorant from home, dabbing it under their noses for a second of familiarity, but the jungle always overpowered it. Nothing sweet lasted. Nothing fresh held its ground. The only smells that survived were the ones that reminded you where you were and why you couldn't escape it. And still, you breathed it in, every minute, every night, as you tried to rest. The smells became part of you, clinging to your skin, your uniform, your gear. Even when you imagined going home, you wondered if you'd carry them back with you, if they'd follow you into clean rooms and dry beds. For now, though, there was no choice. You closed your eyes, pulled the poncho closer, shifted against the mud, and inhaled the same stew again, because it was the only air you had. Sleep in the jungle was never just about heat, or insects, or mud. The hardest part was closing your eyes at all. Fear sat on your chest heavier than any rucksack. It never left, not when the sun went down, not when the rain drowned out the crickets, not even when exhaustion dragged your body toward unconsciousness. Every man knew that the moment you allowed yourself to rest too deeply could be the moment you never woke again. The fear wasn't abstract. It had texture, shape, sound, a twig snapping in the brush, a cough carried by the wind, the faint murmur of voices you couldn't quite place. The jungle distorted everything, turning harmless noises into threats and hiding real danger under the same cover. You could lie in your hammock for hours listening, your heart thudding hard enough you were sure someone else could hear it. You wanted to believe the sound was just an animal, just the forest, just another night. But you couldn't. Not here. Not when you knew the enemy could move silently, barefoot, slipping through the trees with the same ease that you stumbled. Men learned to sleep in shifts, but even then, trust was thin. If you were off watch, you lay with your rifle across your chest, finger brushing the trigger guard, one eye closed and the other cracked open just enough to see shapes in the dark. You told yourself you were resting, but your body was coiled tight, every muscle ready to snap awake. You dozed for minutes, woke with a jolt, listened, dozed again. The cycle repeated until the sun rose, or until someone shook your shoulder and told you it was your turn on guard. The fear seeped into dreams too. Even when you slipped under fully, your mind dragged the sounds of the jungle into sleep. Gunfire blended with the crack of thunder, shouts mixed with the croaking of frogs. You woke gasping, half convinced you were under attack, only to find the forest unchanged. But the feeling never left. Your pulse raced, your palms sweated, and it took minutes to force yourself back down again. Nightmares weren't something rare here. They were just part of the routine, as common as the mosquito bites on your arms. Every soldier developed habits to cope. Some never took off their boots, too afraid of losing seconds if something happened. Others kept grenades lined up within reach, their pins bent slightly outward so they could grab them fast. A few kept flares tied to ponchos overhead, ready to yank the string and flood the clearing with light at the first sound. These preparations didn't make sleep easier. They just made the fear more manageable, something you could point to and say, at least I've done something. At least I'm ready. And the fear wasn't just of attack. It was of not hearing it in time, of being caught unaware. Men told stories of units overrun in the night, of men still tangled in mosquito nets when bullets tore through camp. Those stories spread faster than official reports, carried in whispers that reached every foxhole. Whether they were true in every detail didn't matter. They were believed, and that belief settled into your bones. You didn't want to be the one caught sleeping. You didn't want to be the one whose last moments were spent fumbling in the dark. That dread pressed into every attempt at rest. You lay stiff, eyes darting to shadows that looked like movement. You held your breath when the jungle fell silent, every hair on your arms rising. You pressed your cheek against the stock of your rifle, telling yourself you'd be ready, that you'd wake in time. But no reassurance was strong enough to push the fear away. It was always there, a weight heavier than the mud, louder than the rain, sharper than the mosquitoes. Even in relative safety behind wire or sandbags, the fear didn't leave. Rockets didn't care about distance. Mortars landed without warning. You could be in a base, surrounded by hundreds of men, and still the night shook with explosions that reminded you nowhere was untouched. The jungle didn't give guarantees, and neither did the war. Closing your eyes was always a gamble. Some men admitted later that they never really slept the whole time they were in country. They just collected naps, snatches of half-conscious rest, stolen when fear eased enough to let them. Others said they slept like the dead, collapsing from exhaustion so deeply that nothing woke them until morning. But even those men carried the fear, even if they buried it under fatigue. You couldn't live here without it. It was stitched into every night, every hammock, every foxhole. And so every attempt at rest became another exercise in control. You listened, you gripped, you breathed slow. You told yourself you were safe enough, even when you knew you weren't. You stared into the dark until your eyes blurred, then finally let them close, praying that whatever fear haunted you that night stayed in your head and not in the brush around you. The idea of sleep in the jungle was already fragile, a delicate thing you never really caught in full. But some nights it wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. Nights when you weren't allowed to rest at all, because the orders were different, because the danger was sharper, because the mission demanded that you stay awake and moving through the dark. Those were the nights of ambushes and patrols, when sleep was no longer something you fought for, but something you gave up entirely. Ambushes meant hours of waiting. You'd leave camp under cover of darkness, single file, boots sinking silently into the mud, packs strapped tight to keep them from rattling. No talking, no smoking, no metal clinking. The jungle was alive with sound, but you weren't allowed to add to it. Every twig snap underfoot felt like thunder. Every cough was a betrayal. You walked with your heart pounding in your throat, rifle clutched tighter than usual, knowing you were moving into a place where rest was the last thing you'd find. The position was chosen carefully, a trail where enemy movement was likely, a bend in a river, a clearing at the edge of thick brush. You spread out, each man taking a spot, spacing measured in whispers and gestures, because no one raised their voice out there. Then came the stillness. You lay flat against the ground, poncho spread beneath you if you were lucky, helmet tilted low to keep the rain out of your eyes. The rifle was already pointed where it needed to be, your cheek pressed against the stock, finger hovering just shy of the trigger. And then you waited. Waiting in ambush wasn't like waiting anywhere else. Hours stretched long, each one a fight against your own body. The insects didn't stop just because you needed quiet. They crawled across your arms, buzzed in your ears, bit into your neck. You wanted to slap them, to scratch, to shift, but you didn't. Stillness was survival. Sweat rolled down your chest, pooled at the small of your back, soaked into your collar, but you didn't move. Rain poured sometimes, running into your eyes, dripping off your helmet in steady streams, but you didn't wipe it away. To move was to risk giving yourself away, and so you lay there, body screaming at you to shift, mind screaming at you to stay still. And there was no sleep in that. You tried, some nights, to close your eyes just for a moment, to let the hum of the jungle rock you into a doze, but it was impossible. Every nerve was stretched too thin, every sound twisted by the dark. A snapping branch wasn't just a snapping branch, it was footsteps. A croak of a frog wasn't just a frog, it was a whispered signal. The fear of missing the moment kept you awake, even when exhaustion pulled at your eyelids. You wanted rest, but you wanted to stay alive more. When contact came, it was sudden. Bursts of fire lit up the night, tracers tearing through the trees, the jungle erupting in noise and flashes. The ambush wasn't about sleeping through the night. It was about surviving it, about springing from stillness into violence in the space of a heartbeat. And when it was over, when the shooting stopped and the jungle fell back into its chorus of frogs and insects, there was no lying back down. Your body was buzzing with adrenaline, hands shaking on the rifle, ears ringing from the blasts. Even if the mission ended, even if you moved out, sleep was still hours away. Night patrols were another kind of misery. Moving silently through the jungle in the dark was like walking blindfolded across broken glass. The trees closed in around you, branches snagged at your gear, mud sucked at your boots. You stepped carefully, heel to toe, trying not to splash in unseen puddles. trying not to stumble over roots that reached out like hands in the dark. Your eyes strained for shapes that didn't belong. Your ears caught every sound, every whisper of leaves, every drip of water. The patrols lasted for hours, sometimes all night, sometimes ending only when the sky began to lighten. You couldn't stop, couldn't rest, couldn't close your eyes even for a second. Falling behind meant getting lost, and getting lost in the jungle at night was its own death sentence. You stuck close to the man in front of you, watching the faint shadow of his shape, following the rhythm of his boots. If he stopped, you stopped. If he dropped low, you dropped lower. Communication was by touch. A tap on the shoulder, a squeeze on the arm, a silent gesture passed down the line. Words were too dangerous, sound too revealing. Every step was a fight against exhaustion. Your head nodded forward, your knees buckled, but you forced yourself on. The weight of the pack seemed doubled at night, the rifle heavier in your hands. Your body screamed for rest, but there was nowhere to take it. No place to lie down, no time to close your eyes. You told yourself you'd sleep when the patrol was over, but you never believed it. Something always came after. Another ambush, another watch, another stretch of waiting. The promise of sleep was always ahead of you, never here. The fear in patrols was different from ambushes. It wasn't about staying still. It was about moving without being heard. Every sound you made felt like it carried for miles. A boot slipping in the mud, a canteen clinking against your belt, a branch snapping underfoot. Each mistake could mean contact, could mean fire exploding from the dark. You were tense in every step. Shoulders hunched, fingers tight on your rifle, eyes darting to shadows that looked like men but weren't. The jungle played tricks, shapes shifting, sounds echoing. You were never sure what was real until it was too late. And when contact did come on patrol, it was chaos. Gunfire erupted in the dark, flashes lighting the trees for split seconds, leaving your eyes blinded when they vanished. Shouts overlapped with the crack of rifles, the jungle turning into a maze of sound and panic. You dropped low, fired back, tried to keep your bearings while the night swallowed everything else. Sleep was the furthest thing from your mind. Survival was the only thought, and it burned away whatever weariness had dragged at you moments before. But when it ended, when silence fell again, the exhaustion came back twice as heavy. Your legs trembled, your arms ached, your head felt stuffed with cotton. You wanted nothing more than to collapse, to let go of the weight, to close your eyes just once. But patrols didn't stop for that. Orders pushed you forward. Missions demanded you keep moving. You stumbled through the dark, half awake, half dreaming, your body running on nothing but stubbornness. And when the sun finally rose, when the night patrol ended, there wasn't always time to sleep then either. Another job waited, another march, another hole to dig. For many, those nights stacked up one after another, until the body felt hollow. Men fell asleep standing, heads dropping forward only to jerk back up. Some nodded off during brief halts, slumping against trees, waking only when the line moved again. Others stole minutes in foxholes, eyes closing for as long as their buddy could watch their sector. Sleep became a currency, traded in scraps, and nights of patrol or ambush drained the account until there was nothing left. The jungle itself made sure of it. The wet, the heat, the insects, they never stopped just because you were on patrol. Sweat still poured, mosquitoes still bit, leeches still crawled. You were never free of them, never given reprieve. They added to the misery, layered on top of the fear, making each step heavier, each moment of stillness harder to bear. And through it all, sleep wasn't an option. Not during the waiting, not during the walking, not during the bursts of fire that lit up the night. The body wanted it, begged for it, but the jungle and the war denied it. You learn to live without, to move forward on fumes, to pretend the seconds of dozing you caught here and there were enough. They weren't, but there was no other choice. So when you finally did get the chance to close your eyes, when you finally lay back in a hammock, or against the wall of a foxhole, you collapsed into it, drained. You didn't sleep peacefully, didn't dream softly. You just fell, hard and heavy, until the next order came, or the next sound jolted you awake. Because in the jungle, rest wasn't given. It was stolen, always from something else. And on the nights of ambushes and patrols, there was nothing to steal from at all. Darkness in the jungle wasn't like darkness anywhere else. At home, night fell, and lights flicked on in kitchens and bedrooms. Lamps glowed softly in living rooms. Street lights buzzed on corners. Headlights passed on roads. Even in rural places, the stars above and the moon offered some outline of the world, some comfort in knowing that the shapes around you were familiar. In the jungle, when the sun went down, it wasn't just dark. It was total. It was a wall that dropped over the world, smothering it until you could hardly tell whether your eyes were open or closed. The canopy overhead thickened the blackness, swallowing what little starlight filtered through. Some nights the moon cut gaps into the sky, but more often clouds blotted it out, leaving everything under the trees swallowed whole. Your hand disappeared in front of your face. The man next to you was only a breathing shadow. Shapes dissolved into the same uniform blur, and you had to trust that your boots were landing on solid ground, that the figure beside you was friend and not foe. Darkness wasn't just a backdrop here. It was an opponent, one that shifted the rules of every movement, every thought, every attempt at sleep. It started with the fireflies. They were everywhere in the jungle, pulsing with soft green and yellow glows, scattered through the underbrush like tiny floating lanterns. Back home, fireflies might have seemed harmless, even comforting, something tied to summer nights and open fields. Out here they carried a kind of menace. A flash in the wrong place looked like a signal. A cluster in the distance seemed like a moving lantern, the faint light of an enemy cigarette, the blink of equipment in the dark. Men fired at them more than once, nerves stretched too tight, mistaking the slow pulse of an insect for the sharp eye of a watcher. The jungle used even its smallest creatures to play tricks on you. Flashlights were forbidden for the most part, and for good reason. Even a brief click of white light cut through the black like a flare, visible for hundreds of yards. You could almost feel eyes turn toward it, could almost hear the jungle itself hush in response. When lights were used, they were filtered through red lenses, dimmed to the faintest glow, just enough to check a map, clean a rifle, or dig through a pack. But even that was dangerous. The enemy moved in the dark without them, trained to see with ears more than eyes, to stalk sound instead of shapes. One slip of light, 1 second of carelessness, and the black around you could come alive with fire. That left your own senses to guide you. The problem was, darkness made liars of them. A rustle nearby might be a rat, might be a snake, might be a man. A shadow against the trees might be the wind-shifting leaves, or it might be someone crawling closer. You never knew until it was too late, and so your heart raced at every sound. Your hands tightened on your rifle at every imagined figure. Sleep in that kind of darkness wasn't real sleep. You closed your eyes only to open them seconds later, convinced you'd seen something move, convinced the black had shifted around you. The paranoia never stopped, and sometimes it was justified. The enemy thrived in this darkness. They knew the terrain, knew how to move barefoot across roots without breaking twigs, how to slip silently through brush, while Americans shifted clumsily with boots and gear. They used the dark as cover, approaching camps with patience, sometimes lying flat for hours before inching forward again. A cough, a snore, a match struck to light a cigarette. That was all it took for them to know exactly where you were. The darkness protected you, but it protected them just as much, and maybe more. Some nights you swore you could feel eyes on you, even when you saw nothing. You gripped your rifle tighter, stared into the void, tried to pierce it, tried to find some shape that wasn't there. The fireflies blinked, the leaves swayed, and your imagination filled the gaps. You couldn't stop it. Darkness in the jungle wasn't passive. It pressed on you, sat heavy on your chest, filled your head with thoughts you didn't want. It whispered that something was out there, and sometimes it was right. Even when nothing moved, the dark was suffocating. You lay in your hammock, mosquito net pulled tight, rifle balanced across your stomach, and you felt buried in it. The air was hot, wet, heavy, and the blackness above you only made it feel thicker. You turned your head left, then right, but the view didn't change. It was the same blank curtain no matter where you looked. The sounds of the jungle grew sharper against that backdrop, the steady chirp of crickets, the croak of frogs, the buzz of insects. But those were background. What stood out were the sudden silences. When the crickets stopped, when the frogs cut off, when the jungle's chorus paused for just a moment, every muscle in your body froze. Darkness turned those gaps into alarms, and you lay there, barely breathing, waiting for what might follow. Sleep never came easily on those nights. You drifted, but not deeply. You dozed with one ear open, eyes snapping back open every few minutes. Some men tied trip flares or cans strung with pebbles around the perimeter, hoping they'd rattle before someone crept too close. Others trusted their buddies on watch, but trust didn't erase fear. Even if someone else was supposed to be awake, you never shook the feeling that you should be too. Closing your eyes felt like stepping off a cliff. There were rare moments when light returned. Lightning storms cracked open the sky, filling the jungle with white light for a fraction of a second before smothering it again. Those flashes left you more blind than before. Your eyes burned by brightness, unable to adjust back to the black. Fires from flares or explosions lit patches of the jungle, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Those moments didn't comfort. They terrified because they revealed too much too quickly, then left you stranded in blindness again. The dark also carried memories differently. Men spoke later about how they thought most often of home during the night watches, when everything was black and their bodies begged for sleep. In the daytime, the war was loud, demanding attention, filling every moment with orders and tasks. But at night, when the dark pressed in and nothing else filled the space, your mind wandered. You thought of bedrooms with lamps, of kitchens with humming refrigerators, of the glow of a television late at night. The jungle gave you none of that. It gave you only fireflies blinking like false signals, and the distant hum of helicopters that you couldn't see. And sometimes, even when you convinced yourself you were safe, the darkness turned on you. Dreams blended with the black around you. A sound in a dream became a sound in the jungle, pulling you awake with your heart racing. You blinked, eyes wide, but saw nothing. Just more dark, just more tricks. And you lay there, sweating harder, wishing for morning, knowing morning was hours away. The problem of darkness wasn't just that it hid danger. It was that it made you live with the idea of it constantly. It stole rest, stole comfort, stole the fragile moments when you might have closed your eyes. It turned every sound into a threat, every flash of light into suspicion, every stillness into a test of your nerves. And even when nothing happened, even when the night passed without an ambush, without an attack, the exhaustion still built, because you hadn't truly rested. The darkness didn't need to kill you to win. It only needed to keep you awake. So you lay in it, night after night, sweating under your net, staring into the black until your eyes blurred, ears catching every twitch of the jungle, rifle pressed against your chest. You prayed for dawn, not because it promised safety, but because at least it meant the black would lift. At least the tricks would end for a while. At least you'd be able to see what was coming, even if that wasn't much comfort either. The jungle was never empty. You weren't just living among trees, mud, and rain. You were living among everything that crawled, slithered, gnawed, and skittered in the dark. Sleeping meant sharing your space with uninvited guests. And unlike the buddies beside you, these companions didn't care about silence or discipline. They came whether you were ready or not, whether you wanted them or not. And most nights, you didn't even know they were there until they were already too close. Rats were some of the most common, big ones, larger than anything most men had seen back home, bold and fearless. They crept into camps at night, drawn by scraps of rations, by the salt of sweat, by anything they could gnaw on. You could hear them before you saw them, claws scratching against metal canteens, tails brushing over ponchos, teeth working at cardboard and canvas. They darted across sleeping bodies, sometimes pausing long enough to nibble at food tucked into a pocket. Men woke to the sharp tug of a rat pulling at a ration tin, or worse, the quick bite of teeth, testing whether the flesh of a hand or finger was food too. The sound of them was maddening. Scurrying through gear, knocking over helmets, chewing at straps. You'd lie in your hammock, rifle across your chest, and feel the vibration of one climbing up the ropes, its weight scuttling closer until you swiped at it with a boot or shook the netting hard enough to send it tumbling away, but it never stayed away. A few minutes later, another would come, or maybe the same one, as if the whole jungle were determined to remind you that privacy didn't exist here. Snakes carried a different weight. They weren't constant like the rats, but the fear of them was sharper, more personal. The jungle was home to cobras, vipers, pythons, and dozens more, each with their own way of appearing where you least expected them. Some were deadly, their venom enough to end you in minutes. Others were simply large, their coils thick enough to crush if you surprised them. Boots left outside became hiding spots. Ponchos spread on the ground became cover. Branches above held serpents waiting to drop without warning. Men told stories of waking to feel the heavy weight of something across their legs, of opening their eyes to see the slow, sliding movement of scales in the dim light of a flare. The instinct to move, to kick, To shout was there, but movement meant risk. A startled snake struck quickly, so you froze, breath shallow, heart racing, every muscle locked tight, waiting for it to pass. Some nights it did. Other nights ended in a scramble, boots thrown, hammocks rocking, shots fired into the dark. And even when no snake was there, the thought of them slithering unseen kept your skin prickling, your nerves awake. Insects were everywhere, in numbers too great to fight. Ants marched in lines so thick the ground seemed alive, climbing up gear, through nets, over boots. Spiders wove webs between trees, strands catching your face as you walked half asleep through camp. Some of them were as big as a man's hand, their eyes reflecting light like pinpricks in the dark. Centipedes slid under gear, their bodies armoured, their bite leaving fire that lingered for hours. Scorpions hid in helmets, their stingers waiting for the unlucky hand that reached in too fast. Every item you owned had to be shaken before use. Every boot, every shirt, every pack. Forget once, and you'd pay for it. The crawling never stopped. Even when you lay still, you felt it. The brush of tiny legs across your arm, the tickle along your neck, the sudden sting at your ankle. You slapped at them, brushed them away, but more came. Mosquito nets kept some out, but never all. Hammocks lifted you off the ground, but ropes still became highways for ants and leeches alike. Sleep was never just about closing your eyes. It was about ignoring the constant sensation of something alive on your skin. Leeches were their own quiet enemy. They slid through water, clung to boots, crept up legs, attached silently. You didn't feel the bite. You only felt the slow wetness in your sock hours later, or the squirm when you reached down to adjust your boot. Some swelled fat with blood, before you noticed, dropping off only when they had had their fill, leaving behind wounds that bled and bled. You woke to find socks sticky with it, or hammocks streaked from where they'd been feeding while you slept. There was no way to guard against them completely. Salt helped, or fire, but those were after the fact. During the night, they always found a way. The smell of these uninvited guests mixed with everything else. Rats left a sour odour, sharp and musky. Snakes carried the damp, earthy scent of scales and soil. Insects smelled faintly of mould and rot, bodies crushed under boots or smudged into fabric. The jungle was already thick with smell, but their presence added its own layer. A constant reminder that the space wasn't yours. You were intruding on their home, and they never let you forget it. Some men tried to fight them off. They strung hammocks higher, greased the ropes, burned fires to keep animals at bay. Others gave up, accepting the scratches, the bites, the gnaw marks in their gear. There was no winning, not really. The jungle belonged to the rats, the snakes, the insects. You were only passing through, and they reminded you of that every night. Sleep came, but it was shallow, restless. You dreamed of crawling things, of scurrying shapes, of scales sliding across your chest. You woke with a start, slapping at your arm, only to find nothing there, or worse, something still wriggling under your sleeve. You turned over, pulled the net tighter, closed your eyes again, only to repeat the cycle minutes later. It wore you down, not in one night, but in dozens, until you couldn't tell whether the itch on your skin was real or imagined, whether the sound in the dark was claws or leaves. And when morning came, when you pulled yourself out of the hammock, mud sucking at your boots, uniform already damp with sweat, you found the evidence left behind. Bite marks, gnawed straps, droppings in the corner of your foxhole, holes chewed in rations. The night had passed, but the guests had left their calling cards. You brushed yourself off, shook out your helmet, and prepared to do it all again the next night, because there was no escaping them. They were as much a part of the jungle as the trees and the rain. The uninvited guests weren't just annoyances. They were reminders that you never slept alone, never rested in safety, never truly belonged here. The jungle itself slept better than you did, its creatures thriving in the dark while you clutched your rifle tighter, shifting in your hammock, waiting for the next scratch, the next bite, the next shadow that reminded you how small you were compared to everything that lived here. Even in the middle of war, the body still demanded its routines. You couldn't just collapse into a hammock or curl up in a foxhole without thinking about food first. Eating was never about pleasure here, never about gathering at a table or enjoying something warm and fresh. It was about keeping your body fueled enough to march, to fight, to survive another day. And before the small, fragile hours of rest, there were always the rations. The standard was the sea ration. Heavy cans stuffed into olive drab boxes, hauled around in rucksacks until their edges bent and the paper wrappers softened with sweat. Each meal weighed close to a pound, and every soldier knew exactly what came inside, because the options never really changed. Ham and lima beans, beef stew, chopped ham and eggs, turkey loaf, spaghetti with meatballs. You learned their names by heart, and you learned to hate most of them just as quickly. The cans opened with a clumsy metal key called a P38, a little tool every man carried on a chain or string so it wouldn't get lost. Twist the key around the edge, feel the jagged lid bend back, and the smell hit you immediately. Metallic, greasy, stale. Some ate straight from the can, cold, scooping with a spoon, or even with a knife if that's what they had. Others tried to heat them, holding the can over a small fuel tab, balancing it on rocks, or even setting it close to a burning piece of wood. Heating helped, but it wasn't always possible. You couldn't risk smoke giving away your position, and you couldn't always afford the time to stop. So, more often than not, dinner was cold beans, cold spaghetti, cold hash, swallowed quickly before the next move or the next watch. The taste wasn't just bland, it was actively unpleasant. Grease coated your tongue, salt clung to the roof of your mouth, and every bite felt heavier than the last. Ham and lima beans in particular earned a reputation. Men groaned when they pulled it from their packs. Some traded it away, others threw it into the jungle altogether. It wasn't just that the flavour was bad, it was the way it lingered, the way it mixed with the heat, the way it seemed to sour in your stomach after hours of carrying it around. You ate it because you had to, not because you wanted to. But the small extras inside the sea rations mattered more than the main course. Each box came with a little accessory pack: salt, sugar, matches, chewing gum, toilet paper, sometimes even a tiny can of fruit or a bar of chocolate if you were lucky, and always cigarettes. 4 of them, neatly wrapped, tucked into the pack like a guarantee. Even men who hadn't smoked before picked up the habit here. Cigarettes weren't just a vice. They were a ritual, a comfort, a way to mark the end of the day. Light one after a miserable meal, inhale the sharp smoke, and for a few minutes you weren't just a soldier in the jungle. You were a man with something familiar, something normal. The cigarettes burned fast in the damp air, their smell mixing with sweat and mildew, the ash tapping quietly into the mud. Some men puffed quickly, rushing before orders called them back. Others lingered on each drag, eyes half closed, letting the smoke fill their lungs like it could push the jungle out for just a moment. Matches flared in the dark, tiny sparks quickly shielded by helmets or cupped hands so they wouldn't give away a position. Everyone knew the risk. Light carried far, especially in the black canopy. But some risks felt worth it. Without cigarettes, the night stretched too long. Then there was the coffee powder, a packet of brown dust meant to dissolve into hot water. Hot water rarely existed, so soldiers stirred it into canteens, swirling it until it turned into bitter, gritty liquid. Some poured it straight into their mouths, chewing the grains like dirt, chasing it with warm iodine-flavoured water. It didn't taste good, but it worked. The caffeine jolted the mind just enough to push through another watch, another patrol, another hour when sleep wasn't possible. Coffee in the jungle wasn't about savouring. It was about survival, about tricking your body into thinking it had more energy than it really did. Sugar packets were hoarded like treasure. Men dumped them into the coffee, into fruit cans, into their mouths directly. The sweetness cut through the endless salt and grease of the rations, a reminder of something more human than the rest of the menu. Chewing gum was another prize. It didn't last long, but for a few minutes it gave the illusion of freshness, of cleanliness, something sharp to fight the taste of sweat and metal in your mouth. Eating was always a messy business. There were no tables, no chairs, no clean plates. You crouched in the mud, perched on the edge of a foxhole, sat cross-legged on a poncho spread across damp ground. Your rifle stayed close, sometimes propped against your knee while you spooned food from the can. One hand never strayed far from it, even while the other shoveled food. The smell of the rations carried sweet and greasy, and you ate quickly before it drew attention. Rats scurried closer at the sound of tearing cardboard. Insects swarmed toward spilled syrup or stray crumbs. You ate, you smoked, you wiped your hands on your already filthy pants, and you prepared to lie down in the same stink that clung to you. Rations before rest weren't satisfying. They were mechanical, a checklist you completed because your body demanded fuel. But they shaped the nights. You remembered them more than you expected to. The can of fruit cocktail passed around between 3 men, each taking a spoonful before it was empty. The chocolate bar split into tiny squares, melted in the heat before it even reached your tongue. The way cigarettes glowed faintly in the dark, each ember a reminder that you weren't alone, that others were sitting in the same blackness, sharing the same ritual. Some men grew creative. They mashed crackers into stews, mixed coffee powder with cocoa packets, added hot sauce if they had it. Little experiments in taste, small rebellions against monotony. Others didn't bother, tearing cans open, choking down contents in silence. Hunger made you eat, not appetite, and when the cans were empty, when the wrappers were shoved into pockets to be buried later, you leaned back, stomach heavy but unsatisfied, and reached for your rifle to settle in for what little rest you'd find. The food sat in your gut as you tried to sleep, sometimes churning, sometimes settling like a stone. Cigarettes left your mouth dry, your throat scratchy. Coffee left your pulse running faster, your eyes too wide to close. But the routine mattered more than the result. Eat, smoke, sip, lie down. It wasn't comfort, but it was a pattern. In a place where nothing felt steady, that mattered. And so, night after night, the last thing you tasted before drifting into uneasy sleep wasn't fresh bread or a home-cooked meal. It was canned beans, bitter coffee, stale tobacco. It was grease on your tongue, ash in your lungs, sugar grains between your teeth. The jungle gave you no choice, and you accepted it because fuel was fuel, and the only reward at the end of it was the fragile hope of a few hours of rest. The human body has limits. You can push it, strain it, demand more from it than seems possible, but eventually it pushes back. In Vietnam, soldiers learned this truth every day, especially at night. The body wanted sleep, needed it desperately, but the war rarely allowed it. Guard duty was one of the clearest examples of that struggle, when men were ordered to stay awake through hours of silence and dark, eyes scanning for danger, while every muscle begged to close down, if only for a moment. Guard posts were set up wherever units stopped, at fire bases, in patrol camps, even in shallow defensive positions hacked out of jungle brush. Sandbags were piled, trip flares strung, claymore mines placed, rifles kept at the ready. Each position was manned by a pair, or sometimes a single soldier, depending on numbers. The rule was simple. You watched while others slept. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't optional, and it wasn't forgiving. At first, the adrenaline helped. You took your position, checked your rifle, adjusted your helmet, and stared into the dark. You told yourself you'd stay sharp. You repeated the instructions drilled into you. Scan left to right, watch for movement, listen for changes in the jungle's rhythm. Every snap of a twig made your heart pound. Every rustle of leaves had you gripping the rifle tighter. For the first half hour, maybe even the first hour, you stayed alert, nerves raw and ready. But time passed slowly. Minutes stretched into hours, the blackness ahead of you never changing, the sounds around you blending into a steady background. The insects hummed, the frogs croaked, the rain dripped from leaves, and it all merged into a lullaby you didn't want but couldn't resist. Your body slumped against the sandbags, your eyelids heavier than the helmet on your head. You shifted your weight, sat straighter, rubbed your eyes, but the exhaustion pressed harder. The march during the day, the digging, the constant tension, it all added up, and the stillness of guard duty gave it room to crash down. Nodding off wasn't a decision. It was something that happened to you. Your head dipped forward, chin hitting your chest, before you snapped awake, heart racing, convinced you'd just been asleep for hours when it was only seconds. You looked around frantically, checked your rifle, tried to act like nothing had happened, but the truth lingered. You had dozed, and you knew it. It wasn't the last time either. The cycle repeated itself over and over. Head drooping, jerking awake, fighting to focus, losing the fight again. Some men tried tricks to stay awake. They chewed gum until their jaws ached, slapped their own faces, whispered curses under their breath. Others stuck the tips of cigarettes in their mouths unlit, biting down hard on the filter. A few pressed rifle barrels against their legs or helmets, the cold steel enough to jolt them back for a moment. But nothing lasted. When the body demanded rest, it found ways to take it. Even if only in snatches. Even if only in dangerous seconds. The danger wasn't abstract. Everyone knew stories of attacks that came during the darkest hours, when guards had slipped too far into sleep. Ambushes weren't rare. Mortars came in the night. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army knew when to strike, and they counted on exhaustion as much as on surprise. Falling asleep on guard didn't just risk your own life, it risked everyone's. That knowledge added guilt to the exhaustion, a weight that pressed even harder. You wanted to stay awake, not just for yourself, but for the men depending on you. And still, sometimes, you couldn't. Punishment for being caught asleep on guard was severe. In training, it was drilled into soldiers that dozing at a post was among the worst offences, one that could mean court-martial in other wars. In the field, punishment was usually handled by sergeants, a kick to the ribs, a harsh whisper, sometimes worse. But the real punishment was internal. You woke with your buddy glaring at you, trust thinned, resentment simmering. Falling asleep meant letting someone else carry the weight you were supposed to hold, and that carried its own kind of shame. But judging was easier said than done. Everyone nodded off eventually. Even the strictest sergeant, even the sharpest lieutenant. The jungle wore you down in ways no one could resist forever. Guard duty wasn't about staying perfectly awake. It was about staying awake enough. Enough to notice when the jungle went quiet. Enough to catch the faint outline of movement before it was too late. Enough to buy just a few more seconds of warning for the men sleeping behind you. The hours dragged. Midnight to 2. 2 to 4. 4 to dawn. Each one a test. Each one harder than the last. The black ahead of you never changed, but your body did. Muscles cramped, eyes burned, thoughts blurred. Sometimes you hallucinated, saw shapes moving where nothing was, heard whispers that turned out to be insects. Exhaustion played tricks on you, made the jungle into something even more hostile. You blinked, shook your head, told yourself to focus, but the line between real and imagined blurred too easily. Dawn was the worst and the best. Worst, because the final hours before sunrise were when you were most tired, when your body seemed determined to shut down no matter how much you fought. Best, because light finally returned, giving you shapes instead of shadows, colours instead of black. You counted the minutes to that first faint grey in the sky, the relief of knowing your shift was almost over, that you might get a chance to close your eyes properly. And yet, dawn also brought its own dangers. Many attacks came at first light, when men thought they could finally relax. Sleep never felt earned here. It always felt borrowed. Even when you weren't on duty, the effects of deprivation lingered. You stumbled during the day, head nodding forward as you marched. You forgot small things. Where you'd put your lighter, whether you'd chambered a round. You grew irritable, snapping at buddies over nothing, your nerves too frayed to hold back. Sleep deprivation wasn't just about being tired. It was about being worn thin, being less of yourself than you needed to be. The jungle demanded focus, but exhaustion stole it in pieces until you were running on fumes. And still, guard duty came night after night. You took your turn, sat in your hole, leaned against the sandbags, stared into the same darkness, listened to the same insects. You fought your eyelids, bit down on filters, chewed gum, whispered curses. You nodded, jerked awake, nodded again. And when the shift finally ended, when your buddy shook your shoulder and told you were done, you dragged yourself back to your hammock or your muddy patch of ground, collapsed and closed your eyes, only to start the cycle over again the next night. Sleep deprivation wasn't an exception here. It was the rule. It shaped how men thought, how they acted, how they remembered their time in country. Years later, many said they never caught a full night's sleep the whole time they were there. Just scraps, stolen between guard posts and patrols. Naps snatched in daylight when exhaustion finally forced them down. Guard duty was only the sharpest reminder of that truth, that in Vietnam, sleep wasn't a right. It was a risk. The jungle didn't give much in the way of comfort. You carried mud in your boots, sweat on your back, and fear in your chest day after day, night after night. But sometimes, if you were lucky, there was paper. A letter from home, folded and unfolded so many times that the edges tore, the ink smudged, the creases grew soft with sweat and rain. In a world where everything felt hostile and temporary, those thin sheets of paper were among the few things men held onto like lifelines. Mail call never came on schedule. Some units went weeks without seeing a sack of letters. Others found themselves with piles dropped by helicopters, a sudden avalanche of envelopes and packages after too long without. The moment the word spread, mail's here, everything else paused. Men crowded around, names called out, hands stretching, voices rising. Some smiled, holding envelopes that smelled faintly of perfume, or with handwriting that was instantly familiar. Others pretended not to care when their names weren't read, but the disappointment showed anyway. Letters were read quickly the first time, eyes scanning hungrily, devouring the words. A mother's handwriting, a wife's, a girlfriend's, a child's. They described ordinary things. The weather back home, who'd gotten a new job, what was planted in the garden, how the dog was getting older. They talked about movies playing in theatres, teams winning or losing, neighbours moving away. None of it mattered in the grand sense, but to the man reading it under a poncho in the jungle, it mattered more than anything. It was proof that another world still existed, a world where the air was dry, where beds had sheets, where life moved on without mud and leeches and fear. After that first hungry reading, letters slowed down. They were read again, carefully this time, savouring each line, each phrase. Some men whispered them aloud under their breath, as if hearing the words spoken could bring the writer closer. Others folded them into pockets, carrying them through patrols, pulling them out during breaks, smoothing them flat against knees that were already streaked with dirt. The paper grew soft, the ink blurred, but they kept reading anyway, because the words were all that mattered. At night, before trying to sleep, letters became part of the ritual. You pulled one from your pack, tilted it toward the faint glow of a flashlight under a poncho, or just ran your fingers over the paper in the dark, reciting the words you already knew by heart. Some men tucked them under helmets as pillows, letting the thought of home press against their temples as they drifted into uneasy dreams. Others kept them close to their chests, folded into shirt pockets, as if the paper itself could protect them through the night. Packages added to the ritual. Boxes from home arrived filled with cookies that had long since gone stale, candy melted into wrappers, socks rolled tight with the smell of laundry soap still clinging to them. The taste of chocolate, even half melted, was enough to remind you of a kitchen far away. The feel of cleaned socks against your skin made you forget, just for a night, that your feet were white and cracked from weeks of damp. These packages were treasures, passed around, shared in small bites, savoured until the last crumb. But it was the letters that lingered longer than the food. They carried voices, the only voices that reached through the thick miles of ocean and jungle. They reminded you that you weren't just a soldier here. You were also a son, a husband, a brother, a father, a friend. They tied you to something beyond the mud and the mosquitoes, gave you an identity bigger than the uniform on your back. And before sleep, when the mind turned restless and the body begged for comfort, those letters became anchors. Not every letter brought relief, Some carried bad news, a breakup, a death, a reminder that life was moving on without you. Those letters cut deeper than anything in the jungle. A Dear John letter, ending a relationship in a few blunt sentences, could sit heavier than any rucksack. A letter saying a friend had been killed back home in an accident reminded you that danger wasn't limited to the war, and still men read them. They read them until the words blurred, until anger or grief dulled into exhaustion. Even pain was better than silence. The act of writing back was its own ritual. Paper was scarce, envelopes harder to come by, but men found ways. They crouched in foxholes with pens balanced against knees, scrawling words in the dim light. They wrote about the weather, about the heat, about the insects, though never in the full detail of misery. Most left out the worst parts, not wanting to worry those at home. Some filled a page with jokes, with little sketches, with reassurances that they were fine even when they weren't. Others kept it short, just a paragraph to say they were alive. The mail system was slow, unreliable, and sometimes letters never made it at all. But the act of writing mattered, even if the words never reached their destination. When you finally lay down, mosquito net tucked, rifle close, rain dripping through the canopy, the letter from home often stayed in your hand. You folded it, refolded it, smoothed it flat, then tucked it into your pocket or pack. The words echoed in your head as you drifted toward rest. Maybe it was the sound of a child's name. Maybe it was the mention of a favourite meal. Maybe it was just the familiar curve of handwriting you'd known your whole life. It didn't erase the jungle, but it softened it, made it a little less sharp. Even men who never said much about their feelings clung to letters. They didn't talk openly about missing home, about fear, about longing. But you could see it when they read, the way their faces softened, the way their shoulders loosened, the way they folded the paper carefully instead of cramming it away. In those moments the war seemed to fade, if only for a heartbeat. Sleep still didn't come easily. The jungle was too loud, too wet, too full of fear. But with a letter tucked against your chest, with words from another world resting close to your skin, you felt a connection strong enough to close your eyes for a while. It wasn't peace, not really, but it was the closest thing the jungle gave you. Trying to rest in the jungle wasn't as simple as lying down. It was never just a matter of closing your eyes or finding a patch of ground that wasn't too wet. Rest here was always tactical. You didn't sleep where you wanted, and you didn't sleep how you wanted. You slept where you could, and you slept in ways that made it harder for someone else to find you. Camouflage and concealment weren't just things for patrols and firefights. They followed you into every moment of rest, shaping how you tied a hammock, how you strung a poncho, how you even positioned your body in the mud. The jungle itself was both enemy and ally in this. Its density gave cover, layers of brush and vines that swallowed shapes whole. But it also betrayed you with sound and movement. A hammock tied too openly could be spotted from a distance if the light hit the fabric. A poncho stretched wrong could shine like glass when wet. Even something as small as the glow of a cigarette tip in the dark could betray an entire position. Men learned quickly that concealment was never finished, never perfect. You were always adjusting, always trying to disappear just enough to buy yourself a few more hours of uneasy rest. Camouflage uniforms helped, but only so much. The mottled greens and browns blended with leaves and bark, but sweat darkened them into blotches, and mud coated them into solid patches. Helmets were often covered with netting or tied with bits of foliage, branches woven through straps to break up the round silhouette. The same was done with ponchos, sticks and leaves layered on top to disguise the unnatural lines of stretched fabric. But the rain washed foliage away, and movement made leaves drop, and so every setup had to be redone again and again. Concealment was constant maintenance, and it became second nature even when exhaustion made your hands clumsy. Hammocks weren't strung high or openly, but low and deep in brush, where branches could obscure their outline. The mosquito nets around them had to be tucked in carefully, because even the faint white sheen of netting could catch a reflection in the dark. Some soldiers smeared mud on the nets to dull the shine, turning them into heavy, sagging sacks, but making them less visible. Others left their hammocks entirely and tried to sleep flat against the jungle floor, pressed into the dirt, poncho draped across them like a second skin, blending themselves into the earth. It was less comfortable, but comfort wasn't the point. Staying hidden was. Even resting in foxholes required attention to camouflage. Loose dirt gave away fresh digging, so men scattered leaves over the top, spread branches to disguise the edges. Helmets poking over the rim could be seen from a distance. So many stayed lower, eyes just barely peeking over. When they leaned back to rest, rifles across their laps, they knew the hole wasn't just a bed. It was a hiding place, and if it failed, rest wouldn't matter anyway. The discipline extended to everything around you. Trash wasn't left out, because even a shiny can or torn wrapper could catch light. Empty ration tins were buried or packed away, sometimes carried for miles before disposal. Fires for heating food were rare, because the smoke betrayed you faster than anything else. Even talking before rest was whispered, voices kept so low that sometimes you weren't sure if your buddy had said anything at all. The jungle amplified noise strangely. A word spoken softly could carry further than you meant. Silence became part of camouflage. The hardest part was at night. Darkness seemed like concealment by itself, but it worked both ways. You couldn't see them, but they couldn't see you, unless you made a mistake. A flashlight, even with a red lens, could become a beacon. A cough too loud, a shuffle too careless, and you announced yourself in ways no camouflage could undo. Men learned to cough into sleeves, to bury their faces in ponchos, to move only when absolutely necessary. Trying to rest meant lying still not just because you were tired, but because movement itself risked breaking concealment. Exhaustion made concealment even harder. After hours of marching, of carrying gear, of standing watch, you wanted nothing more than to collapse wherever you stopped. But discipline pressed you into digging shallow depressions, scattering leaves, stringing ponchos in ways that mimicked the shapes around them. Falling asleep in the open, even for an hour, wasn't an option. The jungle was alive with eyes, some animal, some human, and you never knew which. Concealment was survival, and survival was the only path to whatever rest you could steal. Even the smallest details mattered. Helmets placed wrong could shine when rain dripped across them. Watches with reflective faces were smeared with mud or taped over. Dog tags were silenced, taped to stop them from clinking. Rifles were kept close, sometimes draped with vines or cloth to soften their edges. Everything about you had to blend, had to disappear into the jungle, even while you tried to sleep. You weren't resting in a bed. You were hiding inside an environment that wanted to expose you. There was a strange irony in it. Men often spoke about how they felt invisible in the jungle, swallowed whole by the foliage, unseen even by the men lying next to them. And yet at the same time, they felt completely exposed, convinced that someone else, someone out there in the dark, could see everything. That tension made sleep thin, restless, shallow. You lay still, eyes heavy, body aching, but your mind refused to believe you were hidden enough. Every drop of rain felt like footsteps, every shadow like a figure crouching. Camouflage was supposed to protect you, but it also reminded you that you needed protecting at all. Improvisations became common. Some men tied their ponchos over logs or branches a few yards away from where they actually slept, hoping to mislead anyone who might be watching. Others left empty helmets perched in visible spots, decoys for eyes in the dark. It didn't guarantee safety, but it gave enough reassurance to let them close their eyes. You did what you could with what you had, because the alternative was lying awake all night, too exposed, too aware of every sound and shadow. Camouflage wasn't just a matter of gear or foliage, it seeped into behaviour. Men moved less, spoke less, breathed quieter. Even in sleep, habits remained. You curled into smaller shapes, tucked your hands under your body, tilted your face into the ground. The jungle taught you to minimize yourself, to become part of the background. Rest wasn't about comfort. It was about vanishing, about hoping the jungle would treat you like one of its own instead of something separate. And in those stolen moments of rest, when the netting was tucked tight, when the poncho sagged low, when the dirt was scattered just right, you closed your eyes and let the camouflage carry you. It wasn't peace, it wasn't safety, but it was enough to trick your body into stillness. You weren't just sleeping, you were hiding, even in your dreams. Sleep in the jungle wasn't just a physical struggle. It wasn't only about the mud, the insects, the rain, or the fear of being attacked in the dark. Even when the body managed to shut down for a while, even when exhaustion dragged eyelids closed, despite every distraction, the mind refused to rest. Nightmares followed men into the little scraps of sleep they managed to steal, and in Vietnam, the line between dream and reality was too thin to trust. You didn't just wake from bad dreams here, you lived them in real time. The ingredients for those dreams were everywhere. The jungle was a place of constant tension. You carried your rifle in daylight, you clutched it in darkness. You listened to every sound, you thought about every patrol that might come at night. Your body never fully unwound, and so when you finally drifted into sleep, your mind stayed knotted. Dreams weren't gentle escapes. They were reruns of fear, stitched together from real moments and imagined ones. A snap of a twig became a firefight in your sleep. The sound of a helicopter miles away turned into a dream of evacuation, of being lifted out, only to wake and find yourself still in the mud. Rain dripping on your helmet became the echo of mortars. You woke with your heart pounding, body already coiled like it was under attack, eyes wide and wild in the dark. And for long moments, you couldn't tell if it had really happened or not. The jungle gave no clean separation between waking and dreaming. Some men talked in their sleep, muttering half-formed words, sometimes shouting, jolting their buddies awake. Others thrashed in hammocks, arms swinging, boots kicking, until the whole net shook. You learned not to shake a man awake too quickly, because sometimes he woke swinging, still caught in the fog of the dream. More than one rifle was nearly discharged by someone who thought he was still in a firefight When his eyes snapped open, nightmares weren't just private battles. They spilled into the shared space, making rest dangerous for everyone. The content of the nightmares varied. Some dreamed of home, but never in peaceful ways. They saw their families in danger, their houses under attack, their loved ones slipping away just as they reached for them. Others dreamed of patrols that had gone wrong, of ambushes they'd survived but couldn't stop reliving, of voices shouting orders, of men falling, of blood soaking into the mud. The jungle provided endless material for the subconscious, and the mind replayed it mercilessly. Even those who didn't remember their dreams woke with the same pounding heart, the same sweat-drenched fatigue, the same sense of dread. Sleep didn't refresh. It just exhausted in a different way. You woke up more tired than when you closed your eyes, because the nightmares had been battles of their own. The term rest lost meaning. Nighttime was simply another form of endurance. The lack of control deepened the toll. In the daytime at least you could act. You could carry your rifle, march, dig, fight back. At night, in sleep, you were defenceless. Your mind conjured enemies you couldn't shoot, scenarios you couldn't escape, shadows you couldn't banish. You lay trapped in a war your own head invented, even as the real one pressed on outside. There was no safe place to retreat, not even inside yourself. Some men avoided sleep altogether when they could, stretching guard duty longer, smoking through the night, chewing coffee powder raw just to keep their eyes open. The nightmares weren't worth the risk, but eventually the body always won. Fatigue crashed over them, pulling them down whether they wanted it or not, and when they surrendered, the dreams came again. You couldn't escape them. You could only endure them. Letters from home sometimes made their way into dreams, words on paper turning into faces, familiar handwriting becoming voices. For a brief moment, it seemed comforting, but the jungle twisted even those into nightmares. Dreams of home turned sour, with loved ones slipping away, unreachable, or with the war intruding into kitchens and backyards. Even the memories you wanted to cling to most became corrupted in sleep. Reminders that the war followed you everywhere, even into the corners of your mind you thought were yours alone. The nightmares didn't stay contained to the night. They bled into the day. Men marched in silence, eyes shadowed, not just from lack of sleep, but from what they'd seen behind their eyelids. Tempers grew short, patience thinner. Mistakes piled up. Forgetting to secure a strap, stepping too loudly, losing track of bearings. All of it traced back not just to exhaustion, but to the mind being worn raw. Fear in the day was sharp and useful. Fear in the night was shapeless, endless, and draining. Whispers spread through units about who had the worst dreams. Some men cried in their sleep. Some called out names. Some never stopped shaking. It wasn't something mocked, not really, because everyone understood. Even the strongest had their nights broken by visions. Everyone carried their own private reel of images, and the jungle only gave them more material. The strange thing was how normal it became. Nightmares were expected, accepted. You lay down knowing your sleep would bring them, knowing you'd wake in sweat, knowing your heart would pound and your mind would fog. It wasn't about avoiding them anymore. It was about surviving them, night after night, until the rotation ended, until you were out of the jungle. If you ever got out at all. The mental toll built slowly, a drip as steady as the rain. You told yourself you were fine, that it was just dreams, that you could shake them off. but weeks turned into months, and the fatigue dug deeper. You forgot what real rest felt like. You forgot what it was to wake without a weight on your chest. You forgot that sleep was supposed to restore. Out here it just chipped away at you, until the man who woke each morning was less than the one who had laid down the night before. And so, the jungle became a place where nightmares weren't confined to sleep. They stretched into every waking moment, woven through the buzzing insects, the dripping rain, the cries of unseen animals. When you closed your eyes, they sharpened. When you opened them, they lingered. Sleep wasn't an escape. It was simply another battlefield, one you couldn't win, one you couldn't refuse. Sleep in Vietnam was rarely the long, unbroken kind you might remember from home. Out here, it came in scraps. 10 minutes under a tree. 15 leaning against a mud wall. Half an hour in a hammock before being nudged awake for your turn on guard. Rest wasn't something you planned or chose. It was something you grabbed in fragments, stolen wherever the moment allowed, and never long enough to leave you feeling whole. During patrols, snatches of rest came whenever the column halted. Maybe it was to check a map, to adjust gear, to wait for word from a radio. Men dropped to the ground instantly, boots sinking into the mud, rifles balanced across their laps, helmets tilted forward. Heads nodded within seconds, eyes fluttered closed, not because it was safe, but because exhaustion was heavier than fear for just a moment. You could fall asleep standing, back against a tree, pack still strapped on, rifle clutched tight. A buddy's elbow would wake you when it was time to move again. Those few minutes never felt like sleep in the way you remembered it. They were more like collapses, short shutdowns that tricked your body into thinking it had caught something, even though you woke with the same ache, the same fog, the same weariness dragging at your bones. In defensive positions, the rhythm was dictated by watch rotations. 2 hours on, 2 hours off, if you were lucky. Sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, depending on manpower and threat. Off-watch meant lying down, boots still on, rifle still close, and closing your eyes as fast as you could. It didn't matter if the mud was cold, if the insects were biting, if the rain poured through your poncho. You forced yourself to shut down, because you never knew when the next chance would come. 10 minutes of shallow dozing could mean the difference between stumbling through a patrol the next morning and being able to walk in a straight line. There was no comfort in it. You learned to sleep in positions that twisted your body, knees pulled tight in foxholes, neck bent against rucksacks, back pressed to tree roots. You accepted cramps, accepted numb limbs, accepted stiff joints, because comfort was a luxury you didn't have. You taught yourself to close your eyes anywhere, any time. Some joked that they could fall asleep on a pile of rocks if you gave them long enough. And in truth, many did. The body adapted, not because it wanted to, but because it had no other choice. The naps were so short they often felt like hallucinations. You closed your eyes, sank instantly, and when you opened them again, it felt like only a blink had passed, even though 20 minutes were gone. Dreams slipped into them too, brief flashes of home, of patrols, of gunfire, impossible to separate from waking life. Sometimes you woke startled, convinced you'd missed an alarm, hand clutching your rifle before you even knew you were awake. Other times you woke slow, groggy, blinking against the damp air, unsure of where you were for a moment before the jungle snapped back into focus. 10 minutes of rest wasn't enough to restore your mind, but it kept your body moving. It gave your muscles a fraction of recovery, your eyes a brief reprieve from the strain of constant scanning. It wasn't energy so much as survival, enough to keep you from collapsing completely. Soldiers joked about sleep credits, saying they borrowed hours from some imaginary account, but everyone knew the truth. You never got the hours back. You just burned through yourself more slowly. The need for short rest-shaped behaviour. Men learned to doze in pairs, one keeping half an eye open while the other drifted, trading back and forth in silence. Others developed the habit of propping helmets against rifles, letting the sound of metal sliding or wood shifting serve as an alarm if they tipped too far into sleep. Some kept cigarettes burning between their fingers, the sting of ash waking them if they nodded too deeply. Tricks varied, but they all came from the same truth. Nobody could go without closing their eyes forever, no matter how dangerous it was. The jungle didn't make it easier. Bugs crawled into collars, rats scurried across laps, leeches wriggled in socks, rain-soaked ponchos pooled in foxholes, poured onto faces tilted toward the sky. None of it stopped the body from taking rest where it could. Exhaustion was stronger than discomfort. You lay down in mud, on roots, under dripping branches, and still you fell asleep because your body gave you no other choice. The worst was when rest was interrupted. You closed your eyes, felt yourself sink, and then someone shook your shoulder, or shouted, or a shot cracked in the distance. You snapped awake, pulse racing, body stiff, mouth dry. The nap ended before it had done anything, and now you were moving again, more tired than before. That cycle repeated endlessly until days blurred together, marked only by the small scraps of sleep you'd managed to snatch along the way. There was a strange pride in it too. Men compared how little they'd slept, bragged about catching only 10 minutes in 2 days, or about marching for 36 hours without shutting their eyes. But beneath the jokes, everyone understood the cost. Sleep deprivation slowed reflexes, dulled thinking, made mistakes more likely. A man nodding off on patrol could miss movement. A guard dozing could cost lives. Everyone knew it, but nobody could change it. Short rest was all that existed, and you took what you could, even when you knew it wasn't enough. Back home, people thought of sleep as something you either had or didn't. In Vietnam, it became a currency. 10 minutes was valuable. 15 was a luxury. An hour felt like a gift. Men bartered watches, offered to take a buddy shift just to let him sleep a little longer, knowing one day they'd need the favour repaid. Rest wasn't measured in nights. It was measured in scraps, each one hoarded like treasure. And when you finally did get longer, a rare stretch of uninterrupted hours, it felt almost alien. The body collapsed into it so deeply that waking was harder, disorienting. You lay in a fog for minutes, confused by the idea that you had actually slept more than a snatch. But those moments were rare, fleeting, gone before you could adjust. Most of the time, it was still just 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there. The rhythm wore you down slowly, piece by piece. It wasn't dramatic, not like a firefight or an ambush. It was a steady erosion, a grinding away of energy and spirit. You forgot what it felt like to wake rested. You forgot what it felt like to fall asleep without pressure, without fear, without someone nudging you awake before you were ready. Rest became another battle, fought in small increments, and no one ever really won. Coming home from Vietnam didn't mean leaving the jungle behind. The boots were traded for shoes, The rucksack set down, the uniforms stuffed away in closets or storage, but the nights followed. The war didn't let go when the plane touched down, or when the welcome signs came into view. For many, the return was physical only. Their bodies came home, but their sleep stayed tangled in the same routines, the same fears, the same fragments they had learned in the jungle. Bedders felt strange. After months or a year of hammocks sagging between trees, of mud floors in foxholes, of ponchos draped overhead as the only roof, a mattress felt almost unreal. Too soft, too level, too safe. Some lay awake on their first nights back, staring at ceilings that didn't drip, surrounded by silence that felt unnatural. The absence of insects buzzing, frogs croaking, rain hammering on leaves. It wasn't comfort. It was unsettling. Men missed noise, not because they wanted it, but because silence meant their bodies didn't know how to shut down anymore. The brain reached for the sounds it had learned to need, and when they weren't there, rest refused to come. Many couldn't take off their boots at first. Sleeping barefoot felt dangerous, exposed. In the jungle, boots stayed laced tight because anything could crawl in, and because seconds mattered if you had to move fast. Back home, the floor was safe, but the instinct lingered. Some slept in socks at minimum. Others left boots beside the bed, hands brushing against them during the night just to make sure they were still there. Rifles were gone, turned in or locked away, but the absence left its own unease. For so long, a rifle had been part of the body, cradled through sleep as if it were another limb. Without it, hands twitched, arms reached out, and dreams turned sharp with the feeling of being unarmed. The habits carried over in smaller ways too, rolling over cautiously as if not to make noise, waking at the faintest sound, ears still trained to separate crickets from footsteps, sitting up quickly when silence fell, heart racing before realizing it was only the hum of a refrigerator cutting out, or a car passing outside. Guard rotations had rewired the body clock. Many woke every 2 hours automatically, eyes snapping open in the dark as if waiting for someone to nudge them. Rest wasn't measured in full nights anymore. It was measured in fragments, and even in safety, the fragments remained. Nightmares followed most persistently. They came in the same flashes as before. Patrols turning into ambushes, rain dripping into the sound of mortars, fireflies mistaken for signals, shadows in the dark. Some dreamed of firefights they had lived through, others of ones their mind had invented, stitched from fear and memory. Many dreamed of home, but warped by the war. Kitchens under fire, family slipping away, loved ones speaking, but their voices drowned in the sounds of helicopters. Waking in sweat, heart racing, sheets twisted around legs. Those nights stretched on long, after Vietnam ended. Letters from home, once treasured, sometimes became painful to reread. The paper had softened, the ink blurred, but the words carried reminders of a time when the jungle felt endless. Looking at them again in quiet houses, men remembered the nights they'd held those letters against their chest, the nights they'd whispered the words aloud to themselves before drifting into restless sleep. The letters remained proof of survival, but also proof of distance, of how far away those nights had been from the people who had written them. Stories of rest in Vietnam rarely made it into conversations at home. People asked about battles, about helicopters, about what it was like in the day. Few asked about the nights. Few wanted to know about the mud in hammocks, about leeches feeding silently, about the paranoia of every snapped twig. Talking about it felt impossible anyway. How could you explain that sleep itself had become part of the war? That every night had been a struggle, a contest with the jungle and with your own mind? So most didn't. They kept it private, lying awake in quiet bedrooms, turning the memories over alone. Some never found normal sleep again. They drifted in the same shallow cycles they had in country, waking every hour, scanning the room, listening for noises that weren't there. Others found themselves sleeping during the day instead, because sunlight felt safer than dark. Darkness carried too many memories, too many associations with fear and sudden violence. For years, some left lights on in bedrooms, radios humming in the background, anything to fill the silence that had once meant danger. The physical toll showed too. Joints worn from sleeping in awkward positions, backs twisted from months in hammocks strung low and tight, feet scarred from trench foot, skin still sensitive from fungal infections. Even in comfort, the body carried reminders. A mattress couldn't undo months of mud. Clean sheets couldn't erase the sensation of crawling insects. Rest at home was better, yes, but it wasn't whole. It came with ghosts that lay down beside you. Memories that never really let go. The strangest part for many was how quickly people around them forgot. Families expected them to adjust, to sleep normally, to return to routine. But the jungle had rewired them. Rest wasn't simple anymore. It came with fear, with dreams, with instincts that refused to fade. For those who had spent night after night in the jungle, home never felt quite as safe as it should have. You could put distance between yourself and Vietnam, but distance didn't silence the echoes of nights that had stretched too long, too heavy, too loud. Even decades later, many still woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, ears straining. The war was gone, but the habit stayed. Some learned to live with it, building new routines, finding calm in late-night walks or quiet hours with the television. Others carried the weight more heavily, their nights always broken, their mornings always tired. The war had ended, but the struggle for rest never had. And so, remembering the nights in Vietnam meant remembering the way they never ended. 10 minutes of rest here, half an hour there, never full, never safe. Hammocks sagging under rain, foxholes filling with mud, rats scratching, insects biting, rifles clutched against chests, eyes snapping open at the faintest sound. Those nights became part of the men who lived them, and they followed them home, even in quiet bedrooms, with roofs that didn't leak, and sheets that smelled of detergent instead of mildew. The jungle lingered. Sleep had been stolen there, and for many it was never fully returned. And that's how it was, night after night, in the jungles of Vietnam. Not grand battles, not the things that make it into movies, but the slow grind of trying to rest where rest hardly existed. Hammocks that sagged in rain, foxholes that filled with mud, boots that never dried, cigarettes smoked in silence, letters from home clutched like lifelines. 10 minutes of sleep stolen here, 20 there, while fear pressed close and the jungle whispered around you. So if your own bed feels a little softer tonight, if your pillow feels cool and your blanket warm, remember that it hasn't always been so easy for those who came before. The story of sleep in Vietnam wasn't really about comfort at all. It was about survival, about endurance, about taking what little the night allowed and moving forward anyway. Now let your own night be quieter than theirs was. Let the stillness settle in, without rain dripping on your face, without insects buzzing at your ears, without boots laced tight against the mud. Breathe. let your shoulders sink, and let the weight of the day finally ease.